Can the commission attendees in New York City hear us all right?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Please speak up when you're trying to get our attention, because whoever just spoke, the voice was very, very quiet. All right. I think while we know each other around the table very well, I think we'll just go around the table one time, get a quick introduction of everybody at the table, so that anybody that might be tuning into the presentation will get to know all commission members, both here and in New York City. Dr. Willie, could you start?
Ann Willie, Wadsworth Center, New York State Department of Health.
Richard Janney, Wadsworth Center, New York State Department of Health.
John Melville with the New York State Police.
Peter McQuillan, Office of Court Administration.
Gina Bianchi, DCJS.
Kathy Levine, not a commission member, DCJS.
Kathy Corrado, Lab Director, Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences.
Bill Fitzpatrick, I'm the DA in Onondaga County.
Jim Murphy, Saratoga County DA.
And in New York City?
Marina Stiach, Office of Chief Medical Examiner of Toxicology Laboratory. Marvin Schechter, new member of the commission.
Yes.
Mike Lehrer, Chief Director of Toxicology, Suffolk County.
Joe Avella, Director of Toxicology, Nassau County.
Vincent Crispino, QA Manager, NYPD.
Chris Cheney, Lab Director, Yonkers.
Betsy Spratt, Lab Director, Westchester County Toxicology Lab.
Peter Neufeld of the Innocence Project.
Gary Schechter, Innocence Project.
Thank you all, and yes, I want to take a moment to welcome our new board member, Marvin Schechter, who'll be joining us for his first meeting today. As you all will recall from last meeting, Ivar Goldart, after years of exceptional service to the commission, has moved on, and I'm sure we can look forward to working with Marvin for years to come. All right, the first order of business on the agenda today is a review and approval of the meeting agenda. Are there any comments about the meeting agenda, requested additions or deletions? All right, if none, hearing none, I'll move on. We have review and approval of the minutes for the June 29, 2010 meeting. I hope you all had a chance to review the minutes. Are there any suggested deletions or additions? Hearing none, I'm going to ask for a motion. Could I get a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Bill Fitzpatrick seconded.
Second.
Jim Murphy. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, well, that takes us right off the bat to the laboratory updates on accreditation items. And for this, I'm going to turn things over to Catherine Levine.
First laboratory up for accreditation, reaccreditation, is the Erie County Medical Examiner Office Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. Dr. Bob Oshowitz is the lab director, and he should be on the phone to answer any questions. But in your packets of material, you have the letter from ABFT dated June 28th that was granting reaccreditation. And also you have a ABFT inspection checklist as well. There were no deficiencies in essential requirements with this inspection. There were several comments as suggested improvement or recommended corrective action, but these are not mandatory, and they were not did not need to be corrected prior to a vote for reaccreditation. So I don't know, Dr. Oshowitz, are you on the phone? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we hear you fine.
So I don't know if there's any comments, anyone want to have discussion on this accreditation? Yes, Jen.
Bob?
Yes.
Hi, Dick Jenny. There were several recommendations for improvement in the inspection report. Did you, in fact, opt to implement those recommendations? We saw no correspondence
Yes, we did.
between you and ADFT.
Yes, we will meet or change our SOP to meet most of them. There are some that there's one I believe that I don't feel is a critical issue. But yes, we have implemented these changes.
Specifically in regard to the positive control for your cyanide test?
Yes, we will. Actually, yes, we purchased the new paper, and it turns out what we had been using was about a year old, and under the conditions we had stored it, had not maintained stability. So in the new paper, we get much better response to and being able to differentiate a positive from a negative. So we have implemented that.
And one last question with regard to PT E18, which is essential, was recorded as yes, that there were unacceptable results obtained in PT, but there was no presentation as to what those errors were. Could you characterize them for us?
If you could I get back with you on that? I don't have that paper in front of me at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, a question. Does the box holding that paper, does the box itself have an expiration date on it?
No, it does not.
How does one know that it's about to expire?
The question of whether the controls worked or not worked. The controls did work. However, the color change was not as pronounced in a positive control as one would hope. Since we did not have a new packet to compare it against, we were able to distinguish a positive from a negative. It's just that the new material allowed us to go down to a lower concentration or lower sensitivity in the assay. Remember, this is just a screening assay for us, and so any results or any positive results that we've experienced in the past would have always been much, much higher and more pronounced in a routine case than it was in the controls we were running at. We were trying to go down to very low levels, and under those low levels, it was somewhat difficult to distinguish a positive from a negative. But with the new paper, it's better distinction.
Thank you.
Any further discussion?
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
Doctor, my question concerns something you weren't cited for at all. It's experience and training commensurate with the testimony expected of laboratory personnel in your laboratory. Do you keep testimony logs at your laboratory?
Excuse me, I didn't understand that the question.
Do you monitor the testimony of your technicians, and in doing so, do you keep logs or testimonial logs of each time they testify?
Doctor,
no, I do not. I do not for either question.
I guess it would be, a follow-up question would be that in trying to check out testimony, you don't get transcripts of the testimony of any of the forensic technicians at your lab.
At this time, no, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I may follow up on that.
Yes, Doctor.
I have to admit I'm a bit confused at this point. The response in the survey to the question for the lab personnel that testify, is their experience and training commensurate with the testimony expected? The response was yes. Did you just say, how did you just respond to that, Bob?
Well, primarily in this laboratory, I'm the only one that goes to court, and I've been working in the field for 38 years. Just recently, as we started to do the DUI testing, the people go as factual witnesses at this point. If there's a call for an interpretation, then I would also be called to court on that. But in terms of what they're being asked at this point, it's a question of what it is that they did, how was the material received, but not the interpretation as to what the results mean.
Okay.
Any further questions for Dr. Oshowitz? Hearing none, can I get a motion? Kathleen Corrado moved and seconded. Dr. Denny? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right.
The next laboratory is the Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. Dr. Jean Vino is here representing her laboratory. And in the packet of materials you have, there's numerous correspondence between ABFT and Dr. Vino regarding specifically one item, E10. However, they also have, there's also a letter that they have been granted accreditation, and that letter is dated June 29th, 2010. And they've been granting accreditation for the period July 1st, 2010 to June 30th, 2012. And as I said, there's also several comments and recommended actions throughout, but there are, once again, no essential no's in the criteria.
Catherine, what was the date of that letter?
June 29th, 2010.
I've got, what am I looking? I'm looking at August 20.
That was you're looking at, there's some correspondence after the accreditation letter, but as you turn back, on the fourth letter back, there's a accreditation letter. So if there's any discussion regarding any of these issues, Dr. Vino's here.
Any questions for Dr. Vino? Yes.
Well, certainly all appreciate from review of the correspondence between ADFT and Monroe County ME office that there was a contentious issue with regard to quality control practices. It was the finding of the auditing team that in those instances where run or batch quality control were failed for quantitative analysis, that the laboratory would perhaps on subsequent runs or days after its investigation as to possible cause for that QC failure, would reprocess QC and, if acceptable, would deem the results from the previous day's run as being acceptable. ABFT acknowledged that that is not generally accepted practice, and I have to admit in my own experience that that's the case. Now, Monroe County responded with its arguments on its first occasion, and ABFT acknowledged the merits of some of the arguments, but held to its position that it's not generally accepted and that for continued accreditation, Monroe would need to modify its QC policies. Monroe came back with additional arguments, again, some with merit, and I have to say some without. And I've expressed this in previous meetings over the years that ABFT classifies or categorizes its standards as essential and important. And in large part, I think the ABFT decision as to grant accreditation and to accept Monroe's corrective action was because the standard for quality control and the acceptance of the criteria used to evaluate quality control is simply an important standard, not required to be corrected. And in large part it's for that criticism that I question, the appropriateness of the ADFT decision to allow the continued practice of accepting failed quality control in testing batches under certain circumstances, as you have presented. Now, of course, this commission is not bound by essential and important criteria. Quality control is an essential practice. Reliability of lab testing, proper design, implementation, and interpretation, which is very challenging. And it's my opinion that by introducing further variables in the interpretation of quality control through practices of subsequent testing and using that subsequent testing to judge the acceptance of previously run batches, that it introduces further risk into the interpretation of the acceptability of runs, and that those additional risks are not necessary. So it's for that reason that I would recommend, in fact, vote not to extend the New York State accreditation until there is reconsideration and amendment of the QC policy as recommended by the ADFT.
Okay, if I can address a number of issues. Start with, we did make changes in our QC policy, and that was to really spell out our criteria in more detail. But we are not talking about cases in which the only QC in the run is failed. We are talking about an analysis in which we have, generally speaking, a 6 to 7 point standard curve. We are talking about analyses in which we have 2 QC samples from different sources. And we have additional QC. So we have the QC of the calibration curve being having a correlation coefficient of 0.99 or better, with negative controls reading negative. We are talking about some of the QC in the run reading appropriately. We're talking about having duplicate samples for our blood samples. So all of our bloods are run in replicate and duplicate, and that those results all read within the specified 20% of one another. And we have a QC sample. It might be, what we have usually are 2 QC samples. One is from the same source of reference material, but prepared separately or from a separate lot. And the other is from the second source if that's been available. So if we have all these parameters of quality control that are just fine, then we're not looking at a problem in a run. There's nothing that's intrinsic to the run that's an issue. And we're also looking at, generally speaking, our recovery of our internal standards is consistent. So if we then have a problem with a QC sample, with one of the QC samples, it raises the question of, in that separate spiking solution, because what we do is for our analyses, we prepare spiking solutions for the quality control samples. Those are frozen and retained for a period of time, basically until we see deterioration of the quality control results. So if we're seeing deterioration of that particular quality control result, what it's telling us is that there may in fact be a problem with that spiking solution, either with the solution itself or in the preparation of that particular sample. So if that is the case, then we see no reason why we can't prepare another one, maybe even prepare a totally new spiking solution, run it against that curve along with a re-extracted standard, and then along with the old sample, the old spiking solution, and see how that reads against the curve. It's really a revalidation of that new quality control sample, because everything else in that run is telling us that it's fine, it's proper. Now, if that were remade and it's still read incorrectly, then everything gets put aside, because the issue becomes, is it the spiking standard for the controls, or for the spiking solution for the standards that has deteriorated instead of the spiking solution for that secondary QC sample. So in that case, the whole run would in fact get rejected, and we would work to determine where the problem lay with the quality control samples. Once that was established and new solutions were made, we would rerun everything. But to us, we saw no value in rerunning the entire analysis when in fact we had all these markers to indicate that there was in fact no problem that was throughout the run.
Well, that was a scenario that you presented in your arguments to ABFT, an instance where in fact the spiking solution, the spiking standard had deteriorated. Unfortunately, the case that was reviewed by the audit team that cued them into questionable QC practices was never discussed and never discovered. You acknowledge that it had been filed and that you were uncertain which case it was. So certainly in your presentation of an argument, I mean, again, I did, as I already said, I saw some merit in the arguments, but there are many sources of potential error in that analytic process. Mass spectrometry is a very complex process. QC materials are pre-processed to simulate the analysis of casework and are intended to be most sensitive to any error that may arise in this complex sequence of testing. And if that QC were to fail, then I appreciate your argument that there needs to be professional review and discretion as to the interpretation of QC data. And you do acknowledge that there are partial batch reporting, which is standard of practice. For instance, if you identified in some of those specimens that drug was not present, quantification were not an issue or a concern, then you could release those specimens from the batch as being negative. But where quantification and accuracy is important, and QC material and the results are very important in judging the acceptability of the run. It's also stated in the report that you do use historical calibration curves, and it was unclear in your policy whether in fact you would apply retrospective or these questionable QC practices to those analyses where historical curves are run, and in fact the standards, the 6-7 standards, were not processed in a run. So I'll fall back to my argument that it's a very risky undertaking when a laboratory perhaps overreads or attempts to do this troubleshooting in failed quality control, arrive at conclusions that may or may not have bearing as to what happened in an analytic run that's under question. And attendant with those risks is the release of results that in fact may be erroneous. So ABFT clearly remains somewhat concerned with the policies. And again, I feel it's very important that you revisit the quality control program and address it.
Well, relative to a single run in which we were using a historical curve, if your QC is out, your run is done. There is no reporting except the negative values.
That's in your SOP?
I'm just looking at the two primary pages. For example, in one case it says if you have just a positive control, single positive control, you rerun if that's out. So that impartially would address, for example, if you had a small run against a historical curve and you're running one quality control positive and one negative, that's out. If that's saying that, I don't think I say something specifically regarding if you're running against a historical curve. But that would be the policy. That would be how we would interpret it. And I know that this particular run that they pulled was not one in which it was a historical curve. But unfortunately, what they did when they came in is they just randomly chose dates from the last year and said, pull everything from those dates. And then once we pulled all of the cases from those dates, They randomly said, okay, show us this data from this case, this data from this case. So without having written all of that down and tracked it, there was no way for us to just go back and randomly remember, oh, it was case 1675 or whatever. And I have to say, I understand the point, but I feel very, very strongly in a forensic laboratory with the amount of quality control that we do and the number of replicates and the number of, and the ways in which we can look and compare our data to qualitative, concentrations in the initial screens, which we do all the time. And when we're dealing with, we're not dealing with a clinical analysis that has a narrow range of therapeutic versus toxic. We're not doing a digoxin analysis. We're dealing with analyses in which we're interpreting very substantial differences between therapeutic or toxic levels, or even if there's substantial overlap between therapeutic and toxic, your ultimate determination as to whether that was significant in the cause of death is tied into the medical investigator's report, the pathologist's report, the findings of the pathologist in terms of, for example, if it's a central nervous system depressant, a narcotic, are they finding lung congestion and edema that's consistent with that? Is history consistent with that, or was the person walking and talking and suddenly was observed to drop dead? So all of those things go into your interpretation. So to expend, and if I look at something like alcohols, by your argument, Dick, in alcohols we have standardly, I think, 6 or 7 different quality control samples. Multiple external controls, multiple internal controls. When one of those goes out, do we toss the whole run? We have a policy of re-injecting those samples that were between the last good quality control sample and the next good, and the next good quality control sample. But it wouldn't make any sense to toss them all out. Quality control is, when you're looking at 2 standard deviations, you're looking at 96%. That means, by definition, you will periodically have samples that fall outside of that plus or minus 2 standard deviation limit.
No, it would seem wasteful. I mean, that's why laboratories have adopted practices of partial batch reporting based on the quality control in that run, judging the significance of the error you see relative to the specimens in the batch. And we'll acknowledge ABFT has set a standard of 20% or 30%, so it's taking into consideration the intended use of the results that you generate. And as a crediting organization, it holds a standard of allowable errors of 20 to 30%. And I assume it holds labs to that standard.
Any further questions for Dr. Vino? Any comments?
I had a question. I have a question.
Yes, Mark.
Doctor, I noticed that in your laboratory, you have testimony logs of your technicians. Is that correct?
Yes, we keep a record of when they've testified, yes. And what the particular type of case was, yes.
Do you also get transcripts of the testimony?
No, we don't. Other than on, rare occasions, we may get a grand jury transcript before a trial begins, but not generally speaking, no.
So is there any way for you to know, as the head of the lab, how your technicians are testifying in a court of law?
I occasionally get feedback from the ADA, but I'm not reading their transcripts regularly, no.
Do you get any feedback from defense attorneys?
Can't say that I have, no.
And is there any program or CLE, continuing legal education, that you do in the lab or send out for, which involves training the technicians in how to testify in a court of law?
Well, there have been workshops that a number of them have gone to on courtroom testimony, be it at the state level or in conjunction with a national meeting. But we don't have a set program that every one of them must go through prior to testifying. I will generally sit down with them and discuss with them what to expect in a court of law, and help guide them through how to address questions or ways in which they can address questions. But I don't have a specific training module that they go through.
And one last question, following up on your answer along the same lines. Do your technicians know or have a feel for what is exculpatory versus inculpatory evidence?
Well, I'm not sure. Not sure how to answer that.
All right. Any further questions for Dr. Bino? Do I have a motion from the floor?
I have a question.
Yes, Peter.
Not for the doctor, but to you. Dr. Jenny, are you recommending that accreditation be denied at this point?
Yes.
As an alternative to that, don't we have the power, because the TOC standards, we can have higher standards, obviously, than the national accrediting body has. Why can't we simply say that we as a group will require this additional requirement that you're advocating for New York, and then give them accreditation subject to them complying with the additional standard that you've articulated, as opposed to opposing accreditation until the board changes their standards?
Conditional accreditation upon agreement to modify its QC practice that's consistent with ADFT expectations or recommendations.
Right. So it would become mandatory as opposed to simply important in New York State.
Yes, Dr. Corrado.
I guess my feeling is that we've accepted ASCLD Lab and ABFT to be the accrediting bodies, and ABFT has determined what is essential and what is not, and this is not an essential requirement. So if ABFT feels it's that important, they should make it an essential requirement.
Well, that is not how this commission was set up, and it's about time that we come to terms with it. The idea that we were going to delegate out to ASCLD Lab and ABFT and other entities an initial accreditation was specifically and explicitly predicated on the idea that we would not necessarily regard their standards, which, inevitably, knock on them, are often lowest common denominator standards, that we would, in certain instances, require more. And I think that Dr. Jenny has identified something that I don't really hear any serious objection that it cannot be done or should not be done. And it's not really enough of an answer to say, well, ABFT doesn't require it now because as a commission we have a responsibility to do better. That's why we're here.
Well, I agree that the issue that Dr. Jenny has raised is significant and would absolutely be unacceptable in the oversight of the clinical laboratory. And I also agree with you, Barry, that in the history of this commission, the concept of whether deferring to external professional bodies for accreditation was the long-term intended practice unfortunately, regarding this issue, it is our practice, and we have not to date ever set higher standards than those set by ASCLD Lab or ABFT. And I reluctantly have to agree with Dr. Corrado that if we accept ABFT and ABFT has said this is okay, then unless we are going to change, I do believe by formal notice and comment and possible rulemaking, the policy of the commission, we really don't have the option, Barry, of saying to this lab, ABFT's determination is unacceptable. I think we could issue a strong encouragement, guidance, suggestion that this is unacceptable and that this lab should be asked if a quality control is out of control, then the run has to be repeated regardless of the cost and concerns, even with all those other points on your curve being in control. If the records of that run were requested, it would bring question to the veracity of all the results in that run. But I think it can be a strong recommendation, but I don't think it can affect the accreditation of the lab under the current standards of the commission.
If I might interject here, I just really take umbrage at the concept that we have poor quality control. I think we have excellent quality control. And if the commission is going to start making policies, then they need to think very carefully about the impact of those policies. That's why we have oversight groups like ABFT and ASCLD. To say to me if a single quality control in a run is out, well, number one, we have always had policy in forensic toxicology that the director has discretion to say, if there's a quality control sample that's out by 1% and it has absolutely no bearing on the interpretation of the results, that we can accept that. So now you want to make a blanket policy that says we can't do that any longer. If we have 15 quality control results in an alcohol run and one of them's out, because now you've just said, let's make a blanket policy. If we have a single quality control out, we have to throw that run out. Okay, I'm going to throw out a run with 60 samples. It makes no sense to me. Quality control is a statistical calculation, and you will, by statistics, if you never get a quality control sample out, then you're doing something wrong, because statistics say you must get a quality control sample out every 4 times in 100.
As I've said from the outset, the collection and interpretation of quality control data is very challenging. And of course, there must be professional discretion or expertise applied to the interpretation. And again, I've already mentioned partial batch reporting. You review the batch in light of the quality control and make decisions based on that quality control and the acceptability of any one or combination of specimens in that run. The practice that's in question is the reanalysis of quality control on a subsequent day in judging the acceptability of the previous day's run based on that quality control without re-extracting the casework. And, going back to ABFT and its recommendation, well, I think if you read between the lines, ABFT is very uncomfortable with this decision, and it has fallen back on the fact that this is important and not essential. But in looking at the standards, quality assurance and quality control, what is essential is that for quantitative controls, the lab has written criteria for their acceptance. What's important, are these criteria appropriate? It makes no sense to me why it's essential, of course it's essential, to have written criteria for acceptance, but it seems ludicrous not to have the same level of importance, yet that it's essential that those criteria be appropriate.
Is this an issue of time or cost or both? Because I don't know what you two guys are talking about.
There's multiple.
I speak for myself and Mr. Murphy.
Only I've remained silent.
I mean, is it?
I mean, part of this is okay. We're saying we have 8 quality control samples in a run and they're fine, and we have 1 that's out. Now, basically, by any policy, let's say by discretion, I have the option of just saying, we'll accept that run. But in that case, I wanted to verify this other quality control sample. What happened? Is the problem with the secondary quality control sample, or is it with the preparation sample for the standards? So in making that a second, so the issue becomes, okay, there's a whole lot of issues. So ABFT didn't say I have to rerun everything. They actually said I had to re-inject everything. So if I had a 12 hours of re-injection, I have to re-inject 12 hours of re-injection.
What do the other labs do in the state? Do they all get no's too, or do they get yeses?
Well, I mean, we do have a number of other tox lab directors over at the other end there. I'd be happy to hear some commentary. But certainly, things like an alcohol analysis, if you have one out, you re-inject the samples between those. You don't repeat the entire run. You re-inject those between the negative or the failed QC and the next good QC. And so the idea of rerunning, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, that's all right. But my question, though, is it a matter, from your perspective, is it time and money that...
It's both of those.
Okay.
And it's the fact that you may be dealing with samples that you're unable to rerun because you may have cases in which you have very limited sample. So you may, in fact, not even be able to rerun these if you chose to.
See, I'm going to vote for accreditation because of what I read here in the report. And I understand Richard's problem. I'm just wondering, when the coach told me I could show up a week early for camp, for the baseball team, I showed up. It was a pain in the ass, but I showed up. I didn't have to. I'm just wondering if you can make us one big happy family again here and just say, yeah, what the hell, I'm just going to do it. I mean, if that's what ABFT wants you to do, I mean, you feel that strongly about it.
Well, to start with, ABFT was a committee. So the end committee vote was a majority saying they thought that that's something that should be done. So I don't know that the whole committee felt that way. In fact, I did not get that impression from speaking to Dr. Jones. And so I can't interpret this as being entire ABFT. And they also acknowledge at the same time that I had that discretion. So I didn't even have to really look at the secondary QC sample.
I mean, I'm looking at the August 27th letter, and it looks like you beat them down. You won. They gave up, right?
I mean, and it's not that quite honestly, I really wasn't arguing because it cost me money or time. I was arguing because the logic of saying you're going to rerun an entire analysis when you have 8 or 9 QC samples that are perfectly good and one that is bad, and including things like you can identify, whoa, look at that. The internal standard area counts happen to be twice what everything else is in this QC sample. That really looks like when we spiked the internal standard into this sample, we did it twice. Well, I can verify that by just rerunning it again, and then I know, okay, yeah, there wasn't something wrong with the spiking solution for the actual quality control sample. It was that we hit it twice with internal standard. So when you can identify something obvious like that, it's like ridiculous to me to put that time and effort in.
Sean, I'm persuaded by Gene. Is there some? I'm sorry, Barry. Can you hear me? Is there a group, a subcommittee that we could refer this question to, separate from the issue of accreditation? Maybe get an answer, and maybe have somebody.
Yeah, I mean, there's the quality control.
Sean, I think Marina is trying to.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Marina, get closer to your microphone there.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to emphasize what Dr. Jenny said. The issue really was, in this case, reanalyzing a control on a separate day and then using those results to evaluate the run from the previous day. That was the only issue. It was not an issue of whether Dr. Bino had poor or good quality control practices. Obviously, her general control practices are good. So that was really the issue, and I can tell you, Jeannie, that the committee was, I believe, unanimous on this issue, which is why it was brought up, why we insisted on it. And finally, this should no longer be an issue because the ABFT is working on changing these requirements, and all the questions will become essential. So they're meeting in about a month. They have a 2-day meeting, the accreditation committee. They're going to go over all the questions, the requirements again, and I believe that the general consensus is that we will not have important and essential questions, that everything will be either essential or it will not be on the checklist if it's not important.
Good.
And in your laboratory, what do you do?
Well, we definitely will not reanalyze a control on a different day and then use the results of that control to evaluate a previous run. We do have certain assays where we have, like, let's say 5 or 6 or more controls, and then we do have policies that say that, like, I'm using that as an example, 1 out of 5 controls fails, that's okay. You can still accept the run. And as Dr. Bino pointed out, you will always, if you have so many controls, statistically you will expect some of them to be out. But we do not reanalyze a control outside of the run that it was originally in. And I also want to point out that we do have 3 more toxicologists here. One of them is on the accreditation committee of ABFT, so maybe they want to comment.
I'm on the board.
Why don't you give it?
I'm on the board as well from Westchester County. And again, it was the fact that it was 2 days later and then evaluated rather than just saying the run was good, she has 1 out. That was really our concern. It wasn't that, because you can have 1 out. That's absolutely, statistically, one is going to fail once in a while. And our concern was really that she was trying to interpret what happened, and then that was looked at as then accepting that run. And because she explained that it was a frozen control, they do break down. I mean, and sometimes it is hard to tell when that's going to happen, especially if it's with an assay you don't do very often. Bigger concern was 2 days later, then that was used to say it was okay. That was the concern, because we know stuff fails. That happens. And we do partial reporting because we bracket our work with controls, and then we worry about where the bad control was and worry if we have to. Anyone else?
In the practice of quality control, basically, it's a statistic tool to assess the confidence in your assay. So typically, if you run a plus or minus 2 standard deviation, which is considered acceptably, you will have 5% of the time controls that fall out of 2 standard deviations, let's say between 2 and 3 standard deviation. Statistically, 95% of the time, your control will fall within 2 standard deviation, but a perfectly acceptable control will fall out of the 2 standard deviation about 5% of the time. I don't think the QC is an issue from what I've heard, the limited amount of conversation I heard at this meeting. I do agree that running it in the next day or the day after is probably not a optimal technique.
Folks, I'm just wondering, Bill?
Yes?
You guys hear me, too?
Yeah, we can
Hello?
hear you. Yep.
Okay, fine. Bill, for some of us who aren't scientists like you, and I agree with you that we would have to sort of defer in some ways to the scientists who are describing this particular issue. But one thing that Marina said that makes a lot of sense is that, which we can relate to, is basically Dr. Jenny is suggesting that something which was important be construed in New York State as essential. And what Marina is saying is that in a short period of time, the ABFT will probably modify their procedures to make this essential as well. In that case, rather than simply giving somebody accreditation, which would be, I don't know how long it lasts for.
2 years.
For 2 years, likelihood that next month that standard may change, it would seem to me to justify Dr. Jenny's approach if he would modify it to simply say that we will give accreditation subject to their accepting that this one requirement is essential, and no longer important by New York standards, and then move on.
Well, let me ask this, Gene. If between now and the 2-year expiration of the accreditation, if ABFT made this E10 thing essential, would you wait till the expiration of the 2 years to change, or would you change it as soon as possible?
Well, the trouble with making that statement is, if you read that question, it says, are the quality control, how does it read? Criteria appropriate. So that's a statement that, start with, I think my quality control criteria are appropriate. I certainly would attempt to move them even further down the line if that became an essential requirement, just as I said to Graham in the letter. I mean, I said at the time, I just very strongly disagreed based on the circumstances in which, you know, we would use this policy, that there was something inappropriate here, because we have a whole set of guidelines laid out in our protocols that say these are all the things you evaluate. You know, if those things aren't true, you've already thrown out the run. This isn't a question or an option. You've already thrown out the run. So would I move further if they had said to me that regardless of this is where ABFT is going, and based on what they say, absolutely, I would change it. But at the moment, I just felt very strongly.
No, I mean, that argument you should direct to ABFT, okay? And when they do this thing that Marina says they're doing, I hope you have some input in that and try to convince them when they vote on this. But if this E10 were essential today, we'd have no choice but to deny accreditation to you. So I'm going to vote for accreditation, but I just want your assurance that if at some point in the near future E10 becomes essential, you'll change the policy at the lab.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So is that the motion?
Oh, do you want a motion? Are we all done? I'll move to accredit Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office.
Any further, I'm sorry, is there a second to District Attorney Fitzpatrick's motion?
I'll second.
Dr. Corrado. Further discussion?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
You can't hear us.
Hello?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, Dr. Jenny, is her representation acceptable to you, or would you still rather we make that condition mandatory as part of our accreditation for this laboratory right now?
For New York State accreditation, my recommendation is that she adopt what ABFT had strongly suggested is good practice.
Okay.
Immediately.
So, you know,
That's not fair. It's not fair to her. You can't ambush them.
So, I understand.
Okay, we're going to make it.
Bill, I understand what you're saying. I think, Bill, I think you're mistaken about what's fair, what's not fair. And this is why. First of all, and I would disagree with Ann, we have in the past, although on the regular standards we haven't departed from ABFT or ASCLD Lab, we have on certain occasions, because of some particular problem in the laboratory, said that accreditation will be provisional or it'll be conditioned on some other thing that we wanted done. I think, Ann, you're mistaken when you suggest that before we go ahead and require anything additional of any laboratory accreditation, that we have to go through rulemaking. There's absolutely nothing that requires that in the way this commission was set up. And we are free in any particular situation to say, in addition to those requirements of ASCLD Lab or ABFT, we want you to do X, Y, or Z. And that's what we can do, and that's what we have done, although not on a substantive matter such as this, such as general QC. So we certainly have the authority to do it. It was certainly intended that we would do it from time to time, although it was pointed out earlier in this discussion, we have basically declined to make that move. Nevertheless, I mean, given what has been said at this meeting about that the other laboratories are in fact doing what Dr. Jenny is requesting, so in that sense, it seems like this laboratory is somewhat of an outlier in New York State on that particular issue. And not suggesting there's anything wrong with the quality of the laboratory. I don't even think Dr. Jenny was suggesting that, nor was anyone else. I would ask that you accept as an alternative motion, so we can vote it that way, Dr. Jenny's recommendation, that we simply, at this point, rather than simply leaving it to a promise, because we are a regulatory body here, give them conditional accreditation on the condition that within the next X amount of weeks or months, we can set a time limit, and they can simply indicate to us in response that they have done so. Treat this one standard of ABFT as essential as opposed to important. And that way we're giving them a grace period to comply. And I think there's no reason why we can't do that right now.
At this point, we have a motion on the floor that's been seconded. We'll put the motion that's on the floor to a vote. If it doesn't pass, then we'll entertain additional motions as the committee sees fit. So, could I have a show of hands on this motion? All those in favor of the New York State accreditation of the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Lab, please raise your hand.
Toxic. Standing tall.
And all those opposed? And abstained? All right, the lab is accredited as recommended by ABFT.
We can't see what's going on in Albany. Could you tell us what the vote was?
So it was 7-3-2.
Could I just ask a question of Ann, because I'm not, as I understand your position, Ann, you were saying that you agreed that the commission was set up so that we could issue standards that went beyond the accrediting agencies that we delegated initial accreditation to, but you felt because of the practice engaged in the past that it was not fair. There was inadequate notice to this laboratory that we were going to change the rules, and you think we need a rule. Is that what you're saying?
It's certainly my position, and we've shared it in the past, that this commission could decide that the accreditation process in New York was going to be more stringent than the professional organizations that we have deemed to date to be evidence of certification or accreditation. However, we have never done so. We have never set those standards different than ABFT or ASCLD Lab. And if we want to do so, whether it is by formal rulemaking or it is simply by guidance documents that still require notice and comment, we can't change the rules in the middle of the road. And if we're going to say to all toxicology labs, be they ABFT or ASCLD Lab accredited, because they have that option, then this is something they have to meet, then I think we have to say that prospectively. And we could do that as soon as we want to do it, but I don't think we can just come to a meeting like this and say, well, you were meeting ABFT, they've agreed that this is acceptable, although they may change that in the near future. I don't think we can change it today, Gary.
Well, all right. What's disturbing to me about the way we've moved is that I don't want this to be seen as an abdication of our right to impose a higher standard than the agencies to whom we've delegated accrediting may require. At the same time, I don't want to be unfair procedurally to the lab. We've now voted to accredit it, but I would now move that, given that there is an October resolution coming up on this very question. Do I have that right, Marina?
The accreditation committee is having a 2-day meeting in October.
Here. Yeah.
Well, I know that we put a call in to check the bridge at the same time. As of yet, we have not heard back if there's any.
Can you hear us in Albany?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, to answer Barry's question, the accreditation committee of ABFT, I think in October, I think 14th and 15th, and they're going to spend 2 days going over the checklist and over the new requirements. And we have a board meeting a few days following that. So some of the decisions will be made in October. And I hope that this will be one of them.
You know, this is a very useful and important conversation, but it wasn't on the agenda today. We have a very full agenda of things to accomplish. I'm not suggesting that we can't revisit it and have it on the agenda at a subsequent meeting, but at this point, I'm afraid that we may have to move on just because we're never going to get through the agenda if we don't.
I'd like to move the issue of quality control procedures for toxicology labs be placed on the agenda for the next commission meeting, at which time both our internal quality subcommittee and could make a report as well as a report from the ABFT.
On this particular issue?
The issue of quality control and forensic toxicology, which would be the general issue, which includes this.
Okay.
Do we have a second for Dr. Willie's motion? Okay, District Attorney Murphy seconded it. Any further discussion?
Yeah, I seconded it, and I was going to make a similar motion, so thank you, Ann. But I want it to be very clear that, so there's no notice problem, that if the ABFT, for example, doesn't make all important essential, but this particular practice is still outstanding, that certainly a motion will be made. I can't say that we'll have all the votes, but a motion is going to be made, Dr. Corrado, to revisit this question. And the reason is that I don't necessarily feel that I'm expert enough to resolve it, but I am concerned that there is disagreement within the community of toxicologists on this question. And even if ABFT does not adopt the position that the other toxicology offices have done in the state, I think we have to revisit it nonetheless. So this is an issue of notice, okay?
Very good. Any further discussion?
Just one comment.
Yes, Judge McMillan.
Might we not also, at a future time, consider the ASCLAB's classifications of important and essential?
Yes, please, Dr.
I don't have any.
Yeah, the new ISO, the ASCLAB ISO standards, it's all essential. There are no.
But what about
the legacy program still has the essential.
I'm talking about the legacy program. Just legacy.
At this point, we have a motion on the floor to consider the issue of essential and important standards from ABFT at the next meeting.
Well, actually, the motion is to ask for reports from the Quality Control Committee and ABFT regarding issues related to quality control in toxicology labs, which is much bigger than the issue of what's essential.
Okay, very good. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please. Kate?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
So it passes by a vote of 10 to 1. Was there any abstention?
A few people opposed today.
I'm sorry, was there any abstentions?
Hey, Barry, your neck of the woods there, were you guys voting for it or against it? When you said aye.
We said aye. We were voting for whatever the hell Ann said.
They just agree with Ann, whatever she said.
No, she opposed it. So did Maria, right?
10 to 1.
Remind him of that.
10 to 1, that's right.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bino. Moving.
Hey, this is Phil Pulaski on the line. Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Phil.
Okay, thank you.
The next item is the Suffolk County Office of the Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. We have Dr. Michael Lair. Catherine, would you please?
Dr. Lair is in New York City, and we have his accreditation to discuss. He has a June 28 accrediting letter from ABFT, and he has met all his essential requirements and also the required number of important desirables. Please hear if there's any discussion on his inspection.
I want to congratulate you, Doctor, on getting your test on E10. Saved us about 2 hours.
Well, we had no deficiency.
Is there any questions or comments for Michael Lair, Dr. Michael Lair?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Dr. Lehrer, in the report that was done on your lab, you too also have answered the question for the laboratory personnel that testify, is their experience and training commensurate with the testimony expected? My first question is, do you keep testimony logs?
We keep a record of who testified when and on what case.
Okay. After they testified, do you sit down and speak with them and obtain a transcript?
Don't obtain the transcript, but we do sit down and speak with them, either myself or my assistant, and we discuss the issues that came up, the questions that came up, the answers that came up, and we use it as a teaching process, essentially.
So there's somebody in the courtroom with the technician.
Sometimes, but not all the time. But if they're new to testifying, yes. But basically, everybody who testifies in my lab basically is fairly experienced. And again, if there's going to be testimony as to interpretation, it's usually myself or my assistant that's doing that.
And do the technicians in the lab who run the tests, even under your supervision, do they get any courses or training in exculpatory versus inculpatory evidence?
I'm not sure that I can answer that either. But we do have some training courses. New York State, I think a year ago, September, had a 2-day course on testifying in court. And I think 5 of my people attended. And we have also internally some sessions. So I do think that we provide training extensively. We also have a practice of typically meeting with the ADAs before the case. There's a person who's going to testify, and myself or my assistant. And when we're discussing the case, we're discussing the issues, we're discussing what we can scientifically say and support and what we can't. So I think we're doing a fairly diligent job on it.
Do you ever meet with defense attorneys after testimony?
I think I met once with a defense attorney. That was with a phone meeting. They had some questions, and we had a phone conference.
Excuse me, gentlemen.
Yes. I'm sorry.
This is a standard where ABFT said that the lab complied with the requirements. We could probably delve into every circumstance where the lab was found to be in compliance with the ABFT standard. But at this point, since we don't know exactly what the evaluators were assessing there, I think for the sake of time, we're going to have to focus on things where there's problems in the evaluation. Is there any other questions for the doctor?
Yeah, just I appreciate the need to move on and get to many important issues, but I think that Marvin is conducting a very useful sort of exercise here, because just based on the answers that we've gotten so far, I think that it's part of this commission's responsibility to assist laboratories in developing standards for reviewing the testimony of experts and informing everyone of their obligations concerning exculpatory material. Just so you know, it's not really a good enough answer to say we don't know, we have no training on what exculpatory evidence is, because if there's a failure to disclose it, I assure you, you can be sued, and will be sued and have been sued in other jurisdictions. So I think it's been already a useful exercise. I agree that we might be able to take a poll of everybody more informally about it, but I think it's definitely an issue for us to consider and to deal with.
Dr. Corrado.
It's not unimportant.
I have to say something here. I think what's confusing me is the way the question is being asked, because as a laboratory, what's inculpatory and exculpatory, it's all the same in terms of it's all in our notes and it's all turned over, and everyone is trained that everything you do is put in the notes and all of that is turned over on discovery. So when you're asking the question, are they trained as to what's inculpatory and what's exculpatory, in my mind anyway, I don't really understand what it is you're asking. So if you're asking, are they trained as to what needs to be turned over, then I think that's a different question, that's what I wanted to say.
All right, but I have to ask that we focus on anything that was found to be an essential or significant matter. Any further question for Dr. Lara? Can I get a motion regarding the certification of the Suffolk County Office of Chief Medical Examiner's toxicology lab? Gina Bianchi, seconded. Second. Bill Fitzpatrick. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much. Next is the Erie County Lab.
Yes. Erie County Department of Central Police Services is requesting a extension of provisional accreditation in the trace evidence subdisciplines of fracture matches and polymers and duct tape. They received provisional accreditation in this subdiscipline at the commission meeting, and it was for the period of September 22nd, 2009, and it will expire on September 21st, 2009. They have not yet had their their next legacy inspection, which is probably going to be in the spring of 2011. So they will need to request, and I believe they're requesting a 9-month extension on this at least until June of 2011. I'm not sure if the lab director is John Simich. I'm not sure if he's on the phone from Erie, or is the assistant lab director is Paul Mazur. Anyone there?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is John Simich.
Hi, John. And I think the reason they're asking for the request is that they've only had analyzed 2 fracture match cases and 1 polymer case, and so they really haven't had enough cases for an Aztec lab to come back in and review yet. So they need that extension so they can work more cases, and then they'll have enough cases for them to review when they come in there and do their inspection in the spring. Is that correct, John?
Yes, and it will also allow us to continue to provide this service to the law enforcement agencies.
Is there a specific date for the extension to expire? June?
September 21st.
Of 2011?
This year.
Of this year?
It will expire. Their current provisional accreditation in those
No, I'm
subdisciplines
saying
will expire.
their application for an extension to what date?
To I think you just want 9 months, correct?
Well, what date?
June 21st, 2011.
21st. All right.
You need 9 months or you need a year?
Well, we're hoping to have our mid-cycle audit probably for March or April. The application is going to be going in within the next week or two, and it's my understanding that ASCLD is pretty quick with those now. So given if there's any remediation that might be needed, I think June would be minimum, but if we want to be safe, then certainly a year would be ideal.
August 14th is the date that I have a motion that the application for the extension be granted.
I think we should do it then for a year, and then do it till September 21st, 2011, just to be safe.
We were in August, no, you're right, September.
I will second the motion, but I have a comment. This issue of provisional accreditation pending ASCII lab or other actual accreditation, we've raised before as a potential issue in that during this provisional period, when no one has reviewed the procedures and of the individual laboratory, they are actually performing casework, and that where that casework presented and the status or lack thereof of a provisional permit is an issue. And we have asked the question in the past as to whether during this time period these should be real casework, which ASCII lab encourages, or whether these should be split casework, if you will, that the case should also be studied by a duly accredited lab in parallel with the lab operating under provisional standards. And I would just suggest that the Commission revisit the issue of provisional permits and whether or not this is of concern, and if it's concern, in what categories. And we've never resolved that issue, Barry.
All right. At this point, we have a motion and a second with a comment about the split work on the provisional certifications.
Just revisiting the issue of whether the Commission wishes to continue provisional.
But for this motion, we'll take them separately. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. And Judge McQuillan, that's all right with you?
Yes.
All right. Further discussion on Judge McQuillan's motion?
Yes, it's Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Peter.
All right. I just have a question for John. For those of us who are not steeped in forensic science, could you explain briefly what fracture matches and polymers duct tape analysis are, and could you illustrate them? And then could you just briefly explain what the methodology that's used to do the analysis in those two subdisciplines are, please?
Sure. A fracture match would be probably most typical example would be from a case of a hit and run where a motor vehicle will impact a victim.
John, hold on 1 second. They're doing
headlight
something here. I can't hear you.
Hold on for a second. Say that again, Peter.
Hold on. They're doing something technically here. We can't hear you. Just 1 minute. We have the IT people in the room here, and they're fixing something.
To mute your line, press star 6. To unmute, press pound 6.
Hey, this is Phil Pulaski calling Baltimore. It sounds like you got a railroad accident going here. Is everybody okay? Everybody's good.
Checking it.
Don't need that anymore.
Don't need this?
All right. On there. All right. But you can normally.
Okay.
Double the check.
Can folks normally hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. John, I'm sorry, but just mind starting all over again because we couldn't hear you before.
Sure. Okay. A fracture match, probably the most common example that we encounter is in the case of a hit and run, where the headlight lamp will break upon impact with a victim and leave part of it at the crime scene. Those pieces will be collected by the agency, law enforcement agency, and submitted to the laboratory. At a later point in time, if a vehicle is identified and that headlight assembly is recovered, they will submit that to the lab, where the analyst will then attempt to put the pieces back together and demonstrate that they came from that, the pieces recovered at the crime scene came from that headlamp assembly from the car. And that's documented through photo documentation and proper labeling and for court purposes with the report written in. In the case of duct tape, we will encounter that primarily in the case of a home invasion where maybe a victim is duct taped to a chair or bound with duct tape at a later point in time. Either duct tape from another similar incident might be submitted, or even a roll of duct tape might be recovered from an automobile of a suspect vehicle. Those items will then be submitted and compared as exemplars versus question items. And the analyst will look at the composition of the duct tape, including the adhesive, the thread counts, the backing of it, the plastic part of the duct tape, and determine if the various characteristics match and if they could have come from the same batch of duct tape.
John, thank you very much. John, in the latter situation, the duct tape situation, after the analyst does that kind of comparison, says that the tape that was used to tie up the victim could have come from that roll of tape. Is there any database or statistical or probability statement offered by the analyst in court, or is it just left as could have come from?
It's just left as it could have come from, or it's consistent with originating from that roll of duct tape or similar lot.
And there's no sense in the community as to how rare or common that association is?
No, there is not.
Matching up the tear coins.
Just a comment, a comment, Peter. It's much like hair analysis.
All right. Do we have a motion on the floor? A second? We have the second already. All those in favor?
Wait, no. I want to have this. I'm sorry. One other discussion then. I disagree with Ann's perspective about what we have to accept and reject. I would accredit them for fracture matches, but I wouldn't accredit them for duct tape. Not because there's anything wrong with them, but it just seems fundamentally unscientific to allow someone to go into a court of law and say that this duct tape found on the victim's wrist could have come from a roll of duct tape found in someone's home when we all have duct tape in our houses, and the jury is not left with any sense of how rare or how common that match is. And so I would not credit anybody to do something like that in the state of New York.
Just if I may add, there's numerous microscopic instrumental tests for duct tape, so they do not go in with just sort of looking at the duct tape. But like I said, there's a test of adhesive, so all the adhesive would have to match, the plastic coating would have to match, the fabric would have to match, the count of the threads would have to match, and even still, when they have there's so many tests they can do on duct tape that therefore they would still come in with a could have. And if you limit it for duct tape, you're going to be limited for quite a number of other forensic.
The problem is not the number of tests they use. They can use 100 different tests, but just because it has the same fiber count, the same threads, the same plastic coating, I just don't know whether most duct tapes have the same threads, the same plastic coating. I have no idea. And unless you have some way of communicating its rareness or commonness, I don't see why we should allow anyone to ever testify to that in New York State.
Judge McQuillan wants
Peter, it's probably most valuable in excluding. Right? In excluding.
Oh, yeah, he won't have any problem with that.
But once again, since we have accepted ASCLD Lab as our accrediting surrogate, and ASCLD Lab has determined that this is a discipline for which it offers accreditation, and ASCLD Lab has determined that if a lab is to be accredited by them, they must be accredited in all the disciplines in which they practice. So if the lab practices in this discipline, it must be reviewed by ASCLD Lab, and if ASCLD Lab determines them to be acceptable, to date, we have accepted them. We can't, I don't believe, again, without notice and review, start parsing the things we will and won't accept from ASCLD Lab. So I think we have to vote on the motion.
All right. All those in favor of the motion for the extension of the provisional certification to Erie County Department of Central Police Services till September 21st, 2011, please indicate by raising your hand. All those opposed? Keep them up there in New York City for 1 second, please. Okay, Dr. Stasi, do you have your hand up?
No.
No. Okay.
I had it up for yes.
Okay, thank you.
Don't let him bully you, Marina.
Any abstentions?
No thanks for that.
All right, the motion carries.
Hey, Peter, would you have objected to that tire guy and my cousin Vinny?
It was a woman, I think. Yeah, no, she was the best expert I ever saw.
The next item on the agenda concerns the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology.
Hey, I'm sorry, Phil Pulaski. Did I hear somebody mention the New York City issue?
The biology lab. Rest for a little bit.
What?
Mecky's lab we're talking about.
Sorry.
We received a letter from Department of Forensic Biology requesting an extension of their current ASCI Lab Legacy accreditation. It expires on September 23rd, 2010. They are already scheduled for their ISO international inspection, and I believe that they had a tentative date for October 24th for that inspection. This is just to cover that gap between the legacy and the international. So we are requesting, they have requested in the letter dated August 13th, an extension of their legacy until March 23rd, 2011. And we do have, I think, a number of people from New York City Forensic Biology Lab. We have Marie Samples here in Albany, and I think in New York City is Teresa Karajin maybe there. I'm not sure who's there from New York City, but if you have any questions. Eugene? Yeah, there's Eugene. So if there's any questions, but it's just really to cover the gap.
Make a motion that the application to extend to March 23, 2011 be approved.
Second.
Discussion. Hearing none.
I have one question.
Go ahead.
Is there anybody here from ASCLAD Lab or familiar with ASCLAD Lab who can tell us whether there's a difference between legacy and national on the issue of report writing?
I don't believe there's anyone here representing ASCLAD Labs.
No, I'm just wondering whether or not you don't have to represent ASCLAD Lab. Does anybody know who's in this meeting whether there is a difference between the requirements of the content of report writing between legacy and international?
Well, just briefly, the international does list certain components of a report in their requirements.
And legacy didn't?
Legacy did not.
Excuse me. I think that's in the North Carolina lab report that's in our material, that there is a difference.
Well, listen, Ann keeps making this point about what we can do and what we can't do. This is all going to have to be discussed at the next meeting as well, because there are certain things that we can require and should require in New York State, whether it's on report writing or things of that ilk, which people may not have to do if they're technically in compliance with ASCLAD Lab, but nevertheless make sense both as good science and good law in New York we should advance on. So these issues, I guess I'm going to request that this also be discussed at the next meeting as well on a substantive level.
I'm not sure. Regarding New York City OCME Forensic Biology Lab, are we talking?
No, I'm not opposing the vote. What I'm simply saying is, if in fact legacy has no requirements for the content of a report, and international does, and we have laboratories that are still being accredited by New York under legacy, that we may very well wish to impose a heightened requirement on report writing of those laboratories that are still functioning under a legacy model. And I'm not saying we're going to do that today, but I want to take that up at the next meeting.
And just to add to the record, though, all of our legacy laboratories have expiration dates on their legacy accreditation in 2013, so they will be moving to international at around that time. The rest of them.
That's 3 years from now. That could be thousands of criminal trials, and I think that's too long to wait.
Well, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that makes it even more urgent, and I think that we should just add to that the issue that arose here
with respect to disclosure, because I heard Dr. Corrado loud and clear on the issue of exculpatory versus non-exculpatory, and the idea that those issues are not as perplexing if everything is disclosed. So when we talk about report writing next time, we also should discuss how much of the underlying materials are routinely disclosed by the labs to prosecutors and ultimately the defense or any other experts, notwithstanding what the precise rules of discovery are. Those two things, I think, are tied together, and we should note those as an issue for all.
At this point, we have a motion on the floor to approve the New York City medical examiner's request for an extension.
I second.
And it's been seconded. All those in favor, please.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? That passes unanimously. Our next item this afternoon is the Westchester County Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory.
This laboratory, well, Mike Dowd is the lab director, and he can answer any questions, but they just got accredited this weekend at the ASCLD conference. So that material I sent out yesterday was an update. It included the letter of accreditation from the ASCLD lab, as well as their updated inspection report. And this is a mid-cycle inspection, so just keep that in mind that they are still a legacy, and their cycle of accreditation will end in 2013. So this is just the mid-cycle to them. And if there's any questions on any part of that, Sergeant Dowd can answer. Do you have any questions?
I have a question. With respect to latent prints in the summary for this lab, there's an indication that latent print processing examination documentation does not include each processing test conducted, the sequence in which the tests were conducted, the results of each test. And similarly, for latent print comparison documentation, it is not routinely included enough information for another trained examiner to evaluate what was examined and compared. Is there somebody who could tell me why that is? Why does that happen? Why isn't there such documentation?
Sir, were you directing that question to me, or did you open that up? You just
I'm
asked
asking that question to anybody who can answer that question, from Westchester or anybody on the commission.
We have Michael Dowd here with us today from Westchester County. Michael, to the extent you can you answer that for us for the Westchester County lab?
Yeah, part one of that question had to do with latent development and the processes used. What the examiners worked, not all of them, what some of them were doing occasionally, in the case of a piece of evidence that was processed with cyanoacrylate and then subsequently processed with fingerprint powder, the language they were using stated that the item of evidence was processed with cyanoacrylate and fingerprint powder, and no latent identification value developed. What the ASCLD inspection team was looking for was statements at the end of each step in the process. Laboratory policy has been amended to require that the reports issued state the results of each process at its individual conclusion. We've been working on that for the last 90 days, the remediation period. I've sent numerous documents down to ASCLD to support that, and they accepted that fully. To answer the second stage, which was the comparisons, again, we got into a discussion during the inspection of consistency of comparison notes. Again, laboratory policy was amended and changed to require that the analyst, within their case notes, be more descriptive with what they see and what they don't see in making their determination of a correlation or not.
Can I just follow up with you, Michael? What you've been working with AskLab prior to this. Did AskLab not have guidelines for you that you could follow that would tell you, if you were a latent print examiner, what to say and what not to say in the report in terms of what is seen and what is not being seen?
Well, I believe that ASCLAD, the board, issued an interpretation in March of 2008 that required more descriptive language be used. It wasn't across the board in the lab. This is a situation where certain analysts would be more descriptive and others were a little bit briefer in their description. And what was uncovered during the inspection and with the inspector was that the inspector wanted to see more consistent notes from one analyst to another so that another analyst of equal training could read what one analyst wrote and make sense of what that analyst wrote according to their thought process.
Could you tell us in this regard, first with respect to the different processes that are being used to lift the prints, you take photographs of each of those?
Yes, Mr. Scheck. If a print is developed, at any stage that a print is developed, a photograph with a 1-to-1 scale is taken.
Right. So, but they were saying, when they were complaining that that there was not, that the documentation does not include each processing test conducted in sequence. How could that be if you were taking, or are you now taking, prints of each different method, the photographs of each different method, and what was seen of the latent or what may not have been an identifiable latent after each different process? You know what I mean? If you have photographs, why wouldn't you be able to show what was done and the sequence that it was done?
To answer your question, Mr. Scheck, I believe the issue was that we will only photograph when a latent is developed. The issue that the ASCLAD inspector raised during the inspection in June was that the report that was being issued stated in the report that the item of evidence, whether it was a shell casing, whether it was a firearm, whether it was any piece of evidence, if it was processed with cyanoacrylate first and then subsequently processed with fingerprint powder, the report stated that the item of evidence was processed with cyanoacrylate and fingerprint powder and no latents of identifiable value were developed. What we've been able to, or what we've had to do, was document at each stage after each testing process. So in the case notes, what's written is that after cyanoacrylate processing, no latents were developed. The item was further processed with fingerprint powder, and whatever the results of that may have been.
And then on the issue of documentation of the information, could you tell us what the process was? Was there a photograph of the latent, and was there a specific identification of the items that were considered to be either points that matched or discrepancies?
I don't understand the question, Barry.
In other words, when you get to the second point that they were talking about, a comparison examination documentation does not routinely include enough information for another examiner to look at. I'm just curious as to what you were doing. In other words, was there a photograph of the known and the crime scene latent? And was the analyst specifically saying, here is a loop or a whirl or a tent that I consider to be the same in the unknown and the known, or are there discrepancies between the two? But, you know, whatever your data was, how did you guys do it and what was their critique of what you were doing?
The issue raised during the inspection primarily dealt with negative matches, where the analyst either wouldn't pull the trigger, so to speak, where we had an identifiable latent, whether it was submitted to the lab or recovered at a crime scene. And when it was being compared to a known, the analyst, what the inspectors were looking for was language consistent with level 1, level 2, and level 3 detail. You can have a match, and I'm not a latent examiner, but there can be a match without any level 1 detail when there's enough level 2 and level 3 detail present. What we weren't doing was recording the actual levels in each case. If the examiner felt that there was not a match, the examiner was reporting that the latent compared to the known did not match. What they were looking for was more descriptive language as to level 1, level 2, and level 3 detail. Level 1 being loop whirl, level 2 being bifurcations, etc.
Yeah, but my question, I understand that. My question is, but in the reports itself, would there be photographs of the latent known and crime scene, and would there be, circles or notation of, what was what, that the analyst was saying? I mean, could you actually go back and look at the underlying material and see what the analyst was relying upon, regardless of, whether you articulated as level 1, level 2, or level 3?
Yes, sir. Anytime that the latent was submitted, developed, etc., that was deemed to be of value, whether we developed the latent or if it was submitted as such, there would be documentation. The latent would be retained in a case file. We service approximately 42, 43 different police agencies. If a police agency submits a latent that they recovered themselves, we do not return that latent to our customer. It's our policy to retain that latent within our case file for future comparison. And if it was a latent that we developed in the lab during our developmental processes, we would photograph that latent. Now, I believe your question was, do they appear in the report? They do not appear in the report. They are kept in the case file, and if the matter is requested for a Rosario package for court, of course, all that information is turned over to the district attorney's office.
But my more specific question to you was, is there any, I understand you have a picture of the latent or the actual latent, but is there any actual, notation made, that on the photograph of the print that somebody could look at and say, aha, this is the discrepancy, or this is the association that the analyst is making. This is the level 1, level 2, level 3 detail. Would there be some worksheet or physical documentation so that somebody could go back and look at it and figure out what the basis for the opinion was?
We do not mark the evidence directly. If we're requested to make up a court presentation document, that document is copied, typically enlarged tremendously, and then the court presentation document would be noted. There'd be individual marks made to that, but we do not mark the actual evidence.
I would ask, and I don't want to fret upon getting privileged information, maybe things could be redacted. But I think it might benefit us all if we could see exactly some examples of the casework that was being questioned here. And maybe we could also find out from other labs what their procedures are. And I can't remember if I distributed it already, but there is a very important article by the cognitive scientist T.L. Rohr recently on the order in which it would be best for analysts to look at the unknown print and the known. when one should mark up the unknown in terms of detail, when you should look at each of them, and a record of all this. And I say this by way of advance notice that these standards are rapidly changing. I think that the International Association of Identification recently adopted some amendments to their guidelines on what analysts can say with respect to fingerprints that previously they could say was a complete match. Now that's no longer acceptable. We have to make sure that all New York labs are doing this, and we have to have a time to actually discuss the substance of this fingerprint issue because it's coming down the tracks right at us. For those of you that have been listening to us talk about this, we only raised this issue 10 years ago. All right? So I would sure like to see that, and perhaps we can reserve some time to actually see what's being done by this lab and other labs and see if we can find some procedures that we think are best practices that we might consider requiring of all labs that are doing this analysis. So I'd ask that be on the agenda for next time, along with production of these.
At this point, we can't put all of the items that are being requested for future review on the agenda for the next meeting. I know that this item with respect to latent fingerprint accreditation is something that's being looked at both by the Justice Task Force under the Chief Judge and also by the National Academy of Sciences Review Group. We committed to Dr. Jenny the other day that we would report on the progress of those committees to the Commission's Quality Control Subcommittee. And at this point, is that enough there, Barry, for you?
I appreciate that we might be able to do that. What I'm really asking for is if we could find out exactly what was at issue here in Westchester without seeing the case name, just so we can see the actual work, right, that was in question. And if we can find out what our other labs do, right?
There's a problem of practicality of us going behind every issue where there's a non-compliance and accreditation standard to look at what the laboratory is doing with respect to it. How do the other members here feel?
We do have a late technical working group that does meet twice a year, so maybe something could be, directed toward them if you have questions regarding best practices.
I guess I want to actually see what people are doing. There aren't that many of these fingerprint labs, are there? Now, I mean, in New York State, a lot of it is being done. We don't have jurisdiction over. There's only a few we do have jurisdiction over, right? I mean, it's Westchester. It's there's some, I guess, in New York City, and then there's the state. I'd like to just see this particular casework because it was raised as an issue, and I'd like to see it from others. So that we can actually see what we do. And, wait forever for all these different groups to issue reports. We could be behind the curve. We might as well see what we do. That's what I'm asking for. To have this stuff produced and to have any other guidelines or examples of casework produced from the others that do this. To see whether there are uniform protocols already in the state, or if not, how everybody does it, what kind of documentation they provide. It's not like this is a trivial issue. You all know what I'm talking about. This is all controversial. This is all going to be challenged.
Dr. Jenny?
Well, I support Barry's recommendation from an educational perspective. I think it is very important that laboratories share the practices they have in place. Again, the primary thrust for the QA subcommittee is to identify best practices among our accredited laboratories. I don't know how it can be staged, this review of specific casework and placing that in the context of what other laboratories do. But if there is an opportunity, I would ask and recommend that it somehow be pursued. I don't know, technical working groups?
Well, I was going to say it was suggested that it be referred to the technical working group, and I just think that that's what I'm hearing as the difference here. Barry's wanting it to go to the full commission at the next meeting, and Barry, are you satisfied?
I don't mind it going to the technical working group, but what I am saying, very, very specifically, is that I'd like to see this particular set of data produced so we understand what was at issue in Westchester. And I want to emphasize, I'm not picking on them. I'd like to see comparable kinds of work products from the other labs that do this. Off the top of my head, I don't know how many other labs do this that we have jurisdiction over this print analysis, but I would ask that the DJCS assist the commission in getting these materials and asking the lab directors to produce something that would be comparable practices for what was being questioned here in Westchester, so that we have the raw material at with the quality assurance working group, that we actually have data from our labs that we can consider. We know who's doing what.
Dr. Corrado?
I mean, I guess I have a concern with that's. I think it's a good idea for the twigs to get together and to compare, to pick out best practices. I really think you need to leave it to the experts in the field to review these and determine what is and isn't a best practice. I don't really see the point in giving it to others that may or may not understand the discipline, because these things are
I'll tell you right now, I don't want that. I don't defer to anybody on expertise in this field, given the fact that it's been around for so long, and we have a National Academy of Science report saying that there's no there, and the entire standards in the field are shifting. There's no great claim to expertise here that's being generally accepted within the scientific community. I'm not asking for anything other than to see your practices in casework. If this commission can't get production of examples of what our actual labs are doing, then I don't even understand why we're functioning. I mean, we've got to at least be able to see this. I never understand anything unless I actually see it concretely. I'm stupid like that. And so I'm not going to just say, oh, I'm going to let the experts in our labs or anywhere else decide it. I just like to see it for myself, if that's not too much to add. This is a trivial request. Let's face it. I just want to see the data, and if you don't want to show the data, I want to know why.
Okay, so at this point we have two things before the commission. One is the Westchester County Department of Public Safety Criminal Crime Laboratories mid-cycle inspection. It does not require a vote of the commission at this point because it's not reaccreditation report. The other matter that we have is we have a request from 2 or 3 board members, that this be presented to the commission in the future, some presentations of latent fingerprint casework examples, so that they could get smart on the kinds of issues that are of concern to ASCLD labs and their certifications. Since we don't need to vote on the mid-cycle inspection report from concerning Westchester County, we can put that aside. Is there enough interest in the commission at large to see presentations of latent fingerprint work at a future board meeting? I can't pledge to you that it will be the next board meeting because we're accumulating requests at this point. Is there interest among the commission to see this?
Yes, I vote yes.
What are we doing? Barry, what did you want? You wanted...
I just wanted it...
You wanted like a guy to come in...
The subcommittee. I wanted to produce to the technical assurance subcommittee, quality assurance subcommittee. Not necessarily the full committee. I just wanted
an example. That's different from what you said. Okay, that is different from what I understood, actually. So that's fine. So what Barry is suggesting is that we have a presentation. Barry, why don't you just say it in one quick sentence for us?
Yes. I would like production of the Westchester County material and latent print procedures from the other labs that conducted and examples of the casework to be sent to the Quality Assurance Subcommittee so that we can engage with the lab and try to find out what they're actually doing, so so that we would be in a position to eventually make a presentation with the assistance of the laboratory to the full commission. That's all I'm asking.
Is there anybody that has a concern with that? All right.
Are we voting on something?
No, we're not voting. I'm just trying to solicit collective opinions here, and it seems like there's a collective opinion to refer to the Quality Assurance Committee at their next meeting. All right.
One brief question. With respect to latent print PRs, some police departments have recently released the data, or it's been released. Detroit, Houston Police Department. Do you have data that has been released on the PR pass failure rate of people in your lab, on latent prints only?
What do you mean by PR, Joe?
Proficiency reports.
The proficiency reports are released annually to DCJS.
So one would have to go to those reports to see the pass failure rate?
But we have that, and any issues are usually given in the annual report.
Do you know what it is, offhand?
I'm sorry, Judge, what's the question?
Do you know the pass failure rate for your staff on latent prints on proficiency tests?
We've never had a failure.
Never had a failure. Never had a failure.
Well, we've never had a failure, but we've had investigations of failures in laboratories. But we had to review thousands of cases. So what is that telling us?
That's not my
Westchester.
Yeah, the Phyllis Martin case in New York.
This was a question to the Westchester County Lab. All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it. We're now moving to old business, and the first item of old business concerns the Erie County Department of Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory. I think John Simmons is still on the phone.
This is Paul Mazer here. Now, John had a prior engagement that he had to leave for.
Is that her?
This is just a status. ASCOD Lab had asked for a status update on their falsification of laboratory notes non-compliance issue, and they wrote an August 6th letter to the laboratory, who responded with an August 13th letter, which is in your binders. And Paul is just on the phone if you have any questions regarding that. They are in the process of remediating some of the suggestions from the IG report, and they're still in progress on that. And Paul can update you on where they are right now. Paul, have you started the reanalysis, the retesting plan?
Mark, and we are talking in regards to the Kelly McHugh issue?
Yes.
Mark has come on board, like I stated before, that he was going to be starting after Labor Day. He has started. He is in progress of completing his in-house competency training. He's doing 25 unknown samples that we have given him to complete before starting the reanalysis. We are also identifying 158 cases that are randomly going to be selected for him to review or to reanalyze. We're randomly picking out cases, having them retrieve from evidence to make sure that in those particular cases that were randomly selected, that they are cases that are going to be suitable for reanalysis, that there is enough component analysis.
Any questions or further questions for Paul Mazur? Okay, thank you very much, Paul. The next item is the Nassau County Police Department Forensic Evidence Bureau.
Yes, this was a response to a request by Ivar Goldard, who wanted more information regarding the transfer of an analyst from the criminalistic section to firearms. And I asked for a letter from the laboratory the commission had asked for more information. And I believe Melanie McMillan, who's a quality assurance manager, might be on the phone in Nassau County. Melanie, are you there?
She's in New York City.
Oh, she's in New York City. Oh. I don't know if there's any questions regarding this. This was just as a response to Ivar Goldart's concerns regarding that transfer of analyst. It was his concern. Maybe no one else has any questions.
Ivar's gone. Nobody cares. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Melanie. Next, we're going to turn to laboratory disclosure items.
These were just, as a response to the last commission meeting, there was some concern that we weren't getting enough, the commission wasn't getting information on laboratory issues early enough and didn't necessarily want to wait for the annual reporting for some issues, so we were trying to give the commission members a little bit more information. And the first of the issues is the Westchester County Division of Forensic Tox. It was an issue, not a problem in their laboratory, but samples were sent out to the National Medical Services Lab, and there was the problem with switching of labels. Betsy Spratt is in New York City, and if anybody has questions regarding this issue, she can answer those.
Hey, I'm sorry, it's Phil Pulaski. Somebody say something about New York City then?
No.
Not yet, Phil.
She said it's a great place to visit this time of year, Phil. Go back this way.
It's really a lot of fun sitting in the old hotel room here at the Escalade Lab Conference. So, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to try to keep up.
No, there are no issues. We'll move on to the next. The next one was from Monroe County Public Safety Laboratory. That was an issue that was found during the reanalysis project that is occurring. And this was discovered that there were a sexual assault case that was previously examined, and it was determined to be negative, but when it went through the reanalysis, they did find sperm on the microscope slide, and they had to do a corrective action regarding that issue, and it was reported to Escalade Lab. And is Janet Anderson Sequist on the phone? She's also in Baltimore.
Yes, I am. Hey, Janet, if I knew you were down here, we could have had a drink in my room and listen to listen to this.
You're in a lot of trouble now, Phil.
Easy. Hey, Phil, you're on the street.
Phil, as your lawyer, I advise you to stop doing that.
That is a colleague. Thank you, though.
Janet?
Yes.
I had a quick question. When my understanding is when you actually examine a slide for the presence of sperm, that an examiner doesn't literally scan the entire slide because when you're looking at it under a microscope, you're only seeing one very small area of that slide, and that you might look at several, but you certainly don't look at the entire slide. So that when the reanalyst says that he or she observed 3 sperm, and in your analysis in this letter you say, well, it may very well be since there were only 3 sperm, they could have been missed. Are you actually saying that that the second analyst looked at the entire slide and saw a total of 3 sperm?
Yes. What happened was they did look at the slide. There's an area on the slide that was reviewed. The initial analyst looked at the entire slide, saw no sperm. During the reanalysis of the sample, the same slide was viewed by another analyst, and they found in the entire slide 3 sperm.
Thanks.
Janet, this is Bill Fitzpatrick from Syracuse. Could you Could you do me a favor? You say analyst A here only did 3 cases and you rechecked 1. Could you just recheck the other 2 just for the heck of it?
Actually, we rechecked all of them.
Okay, it's not what the letter says, but I'm glad you did.
Yes, we did.
Any further questions for Janet? Thank you very much.
The next lab issue is from Nassau County Department of Forensic Genetics, and that's a missing suspect exemplar sample. Capo Polino is the lab director, and Karen Dooling, assistant lab director, and they're both in New York City. And this just happens due to when they went back to do a recut of a sample, they could not find it, and believe it may be discarded, I believe. They can answer that further. Any questions?
Any questions for either of the representatives from Nassau County?
Was there any impact on the case?
There was no impact on the actual case. This is an internal policy we have when something matches, when a known sample is consistent with an evidentiary sample, we pull the sample and we cut it and we do the analysis. So the first portion of the analysis was already done. And we had got a known sample after that had been already a DNA hit. We had no question that it wasn't that individual. And part of remediation was we pulled all our known samples for the last 2 years, and there were none missing. We found through analyst interviews and other sources that there was a protocol drift going on with their evidence procedures. The analysts, when they were doing these recuttings, instead of returning them right to the retained storage facility, they were giving them to the analyst whose case it was, and then at some point they were putting them back in the evidence locker. We're not sure why they were doing this, but it has been remediated. We conducted subsequent interviews afterwards, and they are now following the practices that they should. And it does seem to be isolated to this one particular case, but it didn't have any consequences.
One comment. I'm just troubled by the very last sentence. The reoccurrence of this incident is unlikely. Since you don't know what happened, how can you say it's unlikely to reoccur?
Well, at this point, we feel it's unlikely because we've gone through 2 years of known samples, and none of them were missing other than this particular sample. It was isolated not to all evidence. They weren't doing this in the practice of that all evidence, this is how they were handling things. It was only in this particular instance where there was a match to evidentiary material and they were pulling the sample and recutting it. So it's a very specific situation where this would even happen to begin with. So that's why we feel that the unlikely to happen again, because it's a very small subset of cases and evidence that gets pulled for this sort of thing, and it's been rectified. And it doesn't seem to be a systemic problem based on our investigation. And in 10 years, of our existence, this is the first time that we've had to report something like this.
It happened because procedures weren't followed.
It happened because of protocol drift. Any other time, somebody takes something from the locker, they put it back. In this particular instance, and it says, "Oh, I need my sample duplicated. Sydney, can you cut it?" She goes and signs it out to herself and cuts it. Now, what Sydney or Anna or whoever should do is they should sign it back into evidence storage and put it back. For some reason, because Analyst 1 was doing the favor for Analyst 2 and it was their case, they would give it back to them, put it back into storage. And probably what happened was this person put it in the file, to go put it back, and it probably split out, or, the supervisor didn't have this practice. We've all worked in other laboratories and had practice in other labs, so we were surprised that they were doing this, but that's what led to the problem, is that they weren't putting it directly back in the evidence locker like they should.
I never heard the term before, protocol. What is that?
It means you have a protocol in place, and somehow what was going on from the beginning of time has somehow morphed a little bit and has caused an issue. And that's what the term explained it correctly, as everybody else understands me.
Marvin, we're having trouble hearing
I'm
you.
sorry. Have you been through a MassClad lab inspection audit yourself?
Oh, many of them, yeah.
Has that ever come up in the course of MassClad lab inspection audit? The concept of protocol drift?
The term definitely comes up in inspection.
Right. And is it the series of questions that they ask? Is it designed to ferret that problem out?
I mean, the whole inspection process is designed to interpret, do you do what you say and say what you do?
And one last question. This particular case, one that you've been talking this about, the supervisors discovered the problem?
The analyst discovered the problem.
And reported it to the
supervisor. Supervisor reported it to the technical leader and the following manager.
And you were satisfied that worked out pretty well. The analyst
Right away.
The analyst wasn't afraid to report the error. The error went to the supervisor. The supervisor passed it on.
She wasn't pleased. She cried for 3 days, but
I would assume
but she
that
had no
professional
fear.
person
Yeah,
would do
right.
that.
She had no fear of coming to us, or I think in a laboratory where quality control and these types of practices and writing up these issues and these quality incidents, that it's not emphasized that it's a penalty or you did something bad and we want to better the laboratory. I think people aren't afraid to report and disclose types of issues.
So the training and the atmosphere you've created for technicians allows them not to do things and report them.
I would hope so.
Well,
and yes, it's my interpretation.
Right.
Yes.
It certainly happened in this instance.
Yes.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.
Yonkers Police Department Forensic Science Laboratory also has an issue with it was a corrective action on PCP, and it was regarding standards. They had problems with the PCP standards around the GCMS spectra. Chris Cheney is the lab director in New York City, and can answer any questions if anyone has any.
One question. The second page of the what is it called? Corrective action report. This sentence. At the present time, the lab has been unable to determine why the instrument is running properly, except for PCP cases. I just find that to be a little lacks clarity, because how can it be running properly except for PCP cases? It's obviously not running properly.
Because it is, for everything but PCP.
Your Honor,
Chris
Cheney, down in the city.
Yes.
The problem we had with this one instrument is that cases run right after the PCP or right before the PCP. We're giving perfect spectra, perfect chromatography, everything within spec. Something in either this batch of PCP we got into the laboratory, or possibly something in the instrument, was not giving the proper spectra for PCP.
We'll see if there's something wrong with the instrument, then I would it's just language. I would not call that instrument running properly.
Chris, do you still have that instrument still in the lab?
The instrument, actually, if you look further on the thing I wrote, at the time this was not working well, Agilent Technology, who we have a service contract with, came in, looked at the instrument, and passed it as working. They came in again after we fully discovered the problem. And what they did was they switched out the entire injection port of the instrument, put a brand new one in. That seems to have fixed the problem.
Okay.
But as to whether that actually caused the problem, we can't be certain. As the other thing you can see, what we've done in the laboratory to prevent this from getting past this again is we've made up a solution of some known standards of drugs, and actually on the corrective action, I put cocaine, heroin, PCP, oxycodone, and alprazolam. We added hydrocodone and MDMA to that, because those are the drugs we see most often, probably 98% of the time in the laboratory, that are run on the instrument. And that sample is run once a week to make sure the instrument is working okay.
Okay.
How old was that instrument? Problem,
I think it's about 5 to 7 years old. It's one of their latest. It's not an ancient instrument. It's one of their newer ones.
And is 5 to 7 years considered getting up there in years for that kind of machine?
It can be, but the laboratory I was in before, Yonkers, Westchester, we have GCMSs that are a lot older that are still working perfectly well.
Finally, we've reached the New York City Police Department laboratory.
Can I walk through this?
Sure.
So this is an update on missing evidence. We sent a letter to Ascalad Lab, QA manager Mike Creasy, and reported that on June 17th, the laboratory received a request from 6-1 Precinct, Coney Island, analyzed 2 separate submissions of controlled substances. The evidence was submitted on May 28th. It included, one submission included 20 tablets of alleged ecstasy. The second submission, 7 bags of alleged marijuana. As we searched the lab for the evidence, we realized that we did not have this evidence in storage. However, we did have documentation from the precinct that it had been delivered, and the evidence control section had documentation had been received. So we notified the Internal Affairs Bureau, and as a result of a review of the security camera tapes for the evening of May 28th, it is clear that the plastic bag containing the evidence was on a table amongst similar bags, a pile of similar bags containing evidence. And the 2 evidence control officers were sitting on either side of this pile of evidence bag, each removing a plastic bag from the pile in order to accession the evidence. The videotape shows a plastic bag slowly sliding down, and falling unnoticed into a trash can. The trash was removed and discarded sometime later during the early morning hours of the intake store. So we still have an ongoing IEB investigation. We have notified the Queens District Attorney's Office Corruption Unit and notified all the other customers involved in this thing. So as folks recall, we had a problem in the past where we had thrown out, before accession, we had thrown out, we believe we had thrown out, we didn't have any solid evidence, but we had a substantial body of circumstantial evidence, suggested we had thrown out with the refuse, with the garbage, evidence that had been brought in. So we put into place a series of procedures to make sure we could distinguish between the trash that was going out and the evidence that comes in large plastic bags similar to trash bags. So we have now put in, while we're still waiting for IAB to finish the investigation and get clearance from the Queens County District Attorney's Office, we put in now a new procedure that all trash receptacles have to be examined so as to prevent the evidence from accidentally finding its way into the trash. So this has been implemented, and a command log entry has to be made to indicate that this trash inspection has been done.
Was there any impact on the case?
Vinny, do you have any information on that?
The only impact on the case that I can imagine is that there was no case. There was never an analysis.
The guy retained Barry Scheck, and Barry swore he could get him off.
There's no evidence, there's no case. So that's the best. That's most likely outcome. We don't know a risk. If off the top of my head, I don't know, but if there were, once we notified the prosecutor's office that the evidence was missing, they would have had to make the appropriate notifications. I don't have the
the cases in front of me, but I know that all the notifications were made, and they presumably couldn't move forward if we didn't.
Yeah, we can get back to the commission with a more specific answer as to the specific disposition of these cases rather than just speculate here. I apologize if we don't have that information available at this moment, but we can certainly get back to you.
The last lab with the issue is
It's just Phil Pulaski again. Is that it for us?
Yes, Phil.
Okay, because we have an executive session issue, but neither Vinny nor I can address it. I believe that the IG, well, I know the IG has an investigation. The Internal Affairs Bureau has the investigation. So I'm going to hang up down here, and I believe Vinny will be leaving. So I had discussed this. Well, I don't know what this allegation is in terms of where it's going. It's being investigated right now. So is it okay, or do you want me to stay on the line?
Yeah.
I'll do whatever's most appropriate.
Actually, Phil, what you suggested is exactly right.
Okay, so I'm going to sign off.
Yes, thanks.
Okay,
Thanks very much.
Well, Barry, I will get the check out to you for your very good legal counsel.
All right, thank you. I'll see you at
10-4. It'd be my pleasure.
the next slide is the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center, and they had a issue regarding a contamination of a negative control, and that was in the toxicology section. Inspector Jerry Biaski can speak to any issues. Questions?
Okay.
We have, for the folks in New York City, we have Inspector Ziowski here with us in Albany. Any questions?
No. I guess the obvious, what was the nature of the contamination of the vendor's product?
We made an inquiry into the vendor, and so far we haven't got a complete answer other than the acknowledgement that codeine was in those SPEs that we're using.
Extraction columns?
Yep. Unbelievable.
And that contamination was not detected in your negative control blank.
We used a total ion chromatograph to scan any presence of drugs, but when we went to the confirmation with the evidence, we used selective ion monitoring. More specific, knocks out the noise. And then, so we're now requiring them to apply that same search to the blanks in the future.
So it did affect cases?
Yes. However, all the cases that were affected, there was another opiate in them, and there were, on the average of 5 other drugs. So the charges remained the same, but the presence of the codeine wasn't there.
Was there a recall for that product? Other labs using the same?
We did make some phone calls to some of the laboratories that are technical supervisor. So at this point, we've not seen a manufacturer recall on it.
Dr. Vino has something to say.
I have a point of information on this. I inspected for Sept, a lab in Wisconsin, last month, and they reported the same problem with the extraction column.
Who was that was just speaking, please?
That was Michael Lero.
Thank you. Dr. Vino has something to contribute to.
So we had a demonstrated problem with a solid phase extraction column. The drug was hydromorphone. Concentration was very low nanogram. It was recognized very quickly that we were seeing this consistent, very low nanogram concentration of hydromorphone everywhere. You put it through the test. You test all your reagents independently, and the only time you get it is if you put, the extraction solvent through the solid phase column. So I think there's been a number of us at this point who have documented that this has occurred. We got new lots of columns from the manufacturer. Those are absolutely fine. We have not heard any reason why that might have occurred either.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're now moving to new business, and in the new business category, we're starting with the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences.
I'll just turn this over to Kathy Corrado. The letter is in your packet, so August 31st, and it's regarding a reorganization of their laboratory.
Our laboratory, the Center for Forensic Science Laboratories, currently houses the toxicology section as well. They are accredited under the laboratory's blanket ASCOD Lab ISO accreditation. Last year, we hired filled a new position with a chief toxicologist, Dr. Mark Lichtenwalner, who comes with many years of experience. And in discussions with him and reviewing many of the different issues that we have organizationally within the laboratory, we made the decision that the ABFT accreditation would be better suited for the toxicology laboratory. And the Center for Forensic Sciences has both the medical examiner's office and the laboratory in the same building, the forensic labs. And so the plan for us right now is to reorganize such that the toxicology lab has applied for ABFT accreditation. And once they obtain that accreditation, we will transfer the responsibility of the toxicology lab from myself under the laboratories to the medical examiner's office. The same toxicologist will still be in charge, and the same, policies and procedures will be in place. It's just a matter of moving the oversight from the forensic laboratories to the medical examiner's office. In terms of personnel, it's the same personnel. And in terms of budget, it actually is the same because the laboratory and the medical examiner budget all roll into one under the health department. We both report to the health department, and our budgets are actually combined at the higher level. So there's really no change other than the oversight of the toxicologist.
Thank you, Dr. Corrado. Any questions? All right. The next item of new business is an update from the Commission Subcommittee on Quality Assurance. Dr. Jennings.
The subcommittee met this past Friday, September 10. Many on the commission, in fact, are members of the subcommittee. I did prepare a summary of the meeting, and I shared with the Commissioner and Gina and Kathy for inclusion in the minutes of this meeting. I can read this report or simply distribute, if you like, for the sake of time.
We will distribute it along with the minutes, your report.
So we just distribute them and not bother reading at this point?
No, but if you'd like to summarize, if you have anything that you think should be summarized for the group.
Well, in a very brief summary, our first meeting, the subcommittee did develop action plans for 7 items of interest. 3 of those action plans were directed toward those activities, lab activities that contributed to the root cause of the questionable practices that were subject to OIG investigation. And what we did is we developed requests for information both to the accrediting organizations and to the accredited labs, asking the accrediting organization what are the minimum requirements for compliance with standards for personnel training, competency assessment, the technical review of work products, the internal audits, the management review of those audits for continuous improvement. The hoped-for outcome is a better understanding of accrediting organizations' expectations of laboratories and those practices adopted by laboratories that have established compliance. And with a compilation of that information from our accredited laboratories, again, hoping to identify the best practices that can in some way be cataloged and shared with laboratories for their adoption. We do have requests for information to the accrediting organizations for the design of their proficiency testing programs or oversight of laboratories. Again, there are several approved PT providers, and it is of interest to the subcommittee, and we hope to this commission, that we have a better understanding of what the standards or the requirements are for acceptable performance. In those instances where there was unsatisfactory performance, what the accrediting organization's requirements are for corrective action. The remaining 4 action items encompass national activities for the improvement of forensic sciences and practices, and the updating of the commission on those advances. The subcommittee recommended that the OFS request NIPLAC to task its technical working groups with the development of briefing documents on the progress being made in response to the NAS report for strengthening forensic science, and to identify the subject matter experts who may serve as a resource to the Commission and to the New York State accredited forensic laboratories for their continuing education. Among the many important recommendations expressed in the NAS report, the standards for lab reporting, that is the terminology, content, interpretive statements, have been identified by this subcommittee as a priority interest. Another is the NIJ-funded work being done to assess the reliability of fingerprint identification. And the subcommittee is to inquire on opportunities for New York State accredited labs to participate voluntarily in those studies. And Barry, we had talked about this now over the past couple of meetings. Lastly, the subcommittee wishes to investigate whether statistical models exist or guidelines can be established for the retrospective casework analysis and sampling design to be used in the investigation of testing irregularities and the development of corrective action plans. The subcommittee will first approach statisticians and the Law Enforcement Center for guidance. So that, in essence, is what we discussed. I think it's a rather aggressive agenda. We do expect to deliver our request for information to accrediting organizations and accredited labs by mid-October, hopefully accumulating responses by mid-December, at which time the data will be, for information, will be analyzed and presented to the Commission at a future meeting.
Yes, Dr. Corrado.
I would like to make a request that if the Quality Assurance Subcommittee is going to be reviewing all of these laboratory policies, I think it would make sense to have at least one technical expert in each discipline on the Quality Assurance Subcommittee. I find it disconcerting that you have an entire body that's reviewing, say, latent prints or toxicology or I don't know, whatever. I mean, at least have one person in the room that's a technical expert, because you could be going down a road of something that truly no one in the room even, maybe there's a misunderstanding or they're not understanding something. I think it makes sense to have at least one, if not more, technical representatives on the subcommittee.
No, certainly the subcommittee would be sensitive to, the scope of its expertise and know when not to make judgment. And we certainly hope that the technical working groups would be a resource to the subcommittee as these materials are reviewed and questions are raised. It's not the purpose of the subcommittee at this juncture to issue those recommendations or suggested best practices. It's simply to review materials with whatever necessary consultation to raise questions of the differences among laboratories, why they exist, is it necessary for them to exist. So the first step is to really just raise questions of observed varying practices.
I appreciate that, but I still think in raising
Albany, could you
questions,
speak up a little bit, please? We can't hear you here in New York.
I was just going to say that I think that it's, even in raising the questions, it really doesn't make sense to do that without at least one technical expert in that discipline in the room. I mean, you could be, by reviewing things, you could be asking questions that maybe are going down the wrong road that a person could at least say, no, that's actually not what that means. It actually means this. I mean, it seems to me you'd want to have at least one technical person when you're discussing a forensic discipline. I think it only makes sense, even if they're just there temporarily for those discussions, if that's how you want it to be.
Well, the makeup of the subcommittee includes quality managers. Several of the team members are quality managers. But, sir, I'm just going yellow.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Battery.
Does that work?
We can't see you either, so we don't know. We can listen to you, but it's a little bit louder.
got a solution on hand.
Okay. So the discussion these past couple of minutes, the qualifications of those reviewing information documents collected from laboratories. There's concern that there may not be adequate expertise to make judgments as to what the next steps would be and to raise the appropriate questions for further discussion. And the subcommittee is attempting to assure those concerns that access to technical working groups and others will certainly address those concerns, make certain that we have access to the required expertise.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the chart of external investigations. The chart has been provided to everybody in advance of the meeting. The items on it are things that we will discuss in executive session. A representative from the State Office of the Inspector General is here today to go over them with us in executive session. Before we get to executive session, we had one more item on the agenda. The independent review of the State Bureau of Investigation of the North Carolina Forensic Laboratory. This was sent to us by Commission Member Schechter, and he asked that it be put on the agenda for the Commission's consideration.
By now, I think most of you are aware of the unfolding scandals in the SBI lab in North Carolina. If you've read the report, before dinner, you will see how bad the situation is. Everything else aside, without going through that whole report, we know at a minimum 7 people have been executed in that state based upon 230 cases. That alone should make people's heads turn. The reason that I asked for this to be put on the agenda is several-fold. I think the North Carolina lab scandal has profound impact and has repercussions for the way the New York State Forensic Science Commission operates. And I'm specifically talking about the portions of that audit that were done that referred to Askeladd Lab. It is pretty clear that there was a massive failure in the certification system. Askeladd Lab certified that laboratory from 1988 and 3 more times total, from 88, 93, and then in 1998. They asked the same questions on the same questionnaires that we've been reviewing here all afternoon. And the reason, I addressed this to the chair, the reason that I asked the questions earlier concerning the testimony in a particular lab and got 3 different answers from 3 different laboratories was to show what the problem is with Askeladd Lab and this certification system. It's a series of questions. The emphasis of the question seems to be on technical procedures, scientific things, how a test should be run. But the problem in these labs and these massive failures that resulted in North Carolina, in Houston, in San Francisco, in Detroit, is that the questions do not emphasize, nor do these teams go after, what are really essentially major problems, which is the relationship, for example, between supervisors and support technicians. Ms. Dooling from Nassau County was able to tell us of an example where they have a lab that encourages and fosters technicians coming forward when they make an error. That's not the case in North Carolina. That wasn't the case in San Francisco. Where were the supervisors when all of this was going on? And it seems to me that it's very, very difficult for me as a commissioner, the newest person on the commission, to sit here for an entire afternoon, and I was here as a guest at the last meeting, and to evaluate lab directors far smarter than me, with much greater expertise, on the certification from Askeladd Lab, when I know that that certification system is a failure. It is not working. And the argument
that this is just a few bad apples in a rotten bunch is dissipating and slowly disappearing, because I don't know how many more lab scandals you can have before you say to yourself there's some kind of systemic failure in what Askeladd Lab is doing. Now, here's what I think is the problem for us in this commission. We are presuming that Askeladd Lab and its question and its certification system is the be-all and the end-all for us to begin a discussion and then reach a conclusion. Earlier in this meeting today, there were several people who said, well, if Askeladd Lab says it, if ABFP says it, that's it, the discussion is over. Before I came on the commission, I did my homework, I read the statute, I read the bylaws. This commission can make rules and regulations that are tougher and certainly far more probing of labs and the way they operate than the Askeladd Lab checklist certification system. In fact, it's really not a certification system. All it is a checklist system. And what's being certified is not what we think is being certified. We don't know why these things are happening in labs. Has it happened here in New York? Yes. We had an investigation by formerly Judge Fish, issued a 115-page report which delved into a massive failure in one of the New York labs. One cannot continue to go on and represent the people of the state of New York in a commission such as this and to make presumptions that all of us know in the face of evidence is not working. So, for example, Dr. Corrado's earlier statement at this meeting that there's no difference between exculpatory and inculpatory, to us it's all the same. You just put it in. That's not happening. Now, I don't say it's not happening in New York. We don't know. We think it's going pretty well here in New York. You can see the level of detail. But we're not sure, nor can we be sure, because the certification system we're depending on doesn't get to the very issues that we need to get to. Earlier in the meeting, the chair raised the issue that when looking at these summaries of these Askeladd Labs, what we should be talking about, maybe for the sake of time today because it's the full agenda, is the issues that are only raised by Askeladd Lab in the summary. I disagree with that. I disagree with that. It's not what's in the summary, it's what's in the questions and how they're asking. And that's the problem that happened in North Carolina. And that's why people died. That's why people were put in prison and are still in prison, probably for crimes they didn't commit. And that's why people died in prison, probably for crimes they didn't commit. I don't want to wake up one morning in New York State and have that kind of scandal on my shoulders, sir. So here's what I'm asking for. At a minimum, I would ask that the commission consider seriously that this report be sent by this commission to every lab director under our jurisdiction with a cover letter from the commission indicating our concern and our belief that this ought to be read and studied as an example of how not to do it. Secondly, I would ask that we be allowed to distribute to the entire commission the results of the Raleigh News and Observer's 4-part expose, which is what led to this report. And that 4-part expose with all of the related articles be sent to every member of this commission. I know an objection was raised when I brought this up, that by sending people news reports of an expose, we're getting a reporter's view of a situation. If that is the case, I have great faith that the members of this commission will be able to sort out what is opinion and what is fact evidence. Clearly, the audit of the North Carolina SBI blood serology unit, it's only one unit that's being examined here, and partly the DNA unit. People will be able to figure out for themselves, but you all ought to have that information. I am prepared to get all that information to every member of the commission if you permit me to do so. Third, if it's not on the agenda at the next meeting, then hopefully I ask the chair to put it on for the meeting after. We saw an incredible example today of exactly the same problem they had in North Carolina. When all of this was discovered, that they had done a presumptive test for the presence of blood,
and then they've done a confirmatory test that came out negative or inconclusive, and it was in the bench notes, and it was hidden from the defense, from the prosecutors, from everybody. And in some instances where it came back negative, there was lying testimony. Forensic examiner went into court and lied and said the test was present for blood. Led to Mr. Taylor, right? Is that correct, Taylor? Doing 17 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, based upon the evidence. Now, it seems to me that what the chief point that was made in the North Carolina audit was the issue of report writing. And when they were caught, and they're still saying this, the very same people who were caught doing this, lying on the witness stand, writing false reports, hiding exculpatory evidence, their answer was, that was the policy of the lab. That was the policy as we understood it and were told it by our supervisors. That was the policy that existed, and by the way, a policy they fell back on because they were able to say, and the audit confirmed it, that up through 2004, ASCLD Lab did not have specific guidelines for report writing. The earlier question that was asked by Peter Neufeld, whether or not there's a difference between the legacy and the international, is partly answerable because it's answered in the audit, the North Carolina audit. As of this moment, the meeting of this New York State Forensic Science Commission, ASCLD Lab still does not have a policy that tells you what to say in the report. It tells you what items you should cover. That they've gotten much more specific about. But it doesn't tell you what to write. And of course, as the audit in North Carolina discovered, somehow the technicians in that lab and all of those supervisors somehow figured out a model where you can take a positive test for blood and report it as positive even though you have a negative test in your file. How is that possible if there's a certification system in place? So my feeling is that I hope we get to, and I ask the chair to please put this on the agenda for the future. My final point is this.
What?
The commission, this commission is going to have to start to face up to the fact that it must make rules, better rules than ASCLD Lab. It might even be helpful to this commission, and it's up to the chair if you want to do this. I don't know that I could contain myself, but maybe we would want to call the ASCLD Lab director and ask them to come to a meeting of this commission and to explain to us what is going on. After all, this commission is depending upon the ASCLD Lab certifications to do its work. So it seems to me we might want to hear from these people. I do know this, that as of 4 hours ago, before I came to the meeting, ASCLD Lab has yet to go public with any statement whatsoever on the massive failure in North Carolina. So that's my hope. Those are some of the things that I was very upset about. I can tell you that this is not going away. North Carolina is not only dealing with it, but major organizations around the country are dealing with this issue. Almost everyone I know in the criminal justice community, at least on the defense side, and in the middle ground, people who are in the criminal justice system, are getting hold of this report and the related news articles to advance them. What prosecutors are doing, I have no idea. I certainly would hope that the District Attorneys Association will get some of this information. But for this commission, those are my specific requests, and I hope that the chair will act on them.
Okay, as for the report writing point, I think we resolved earlier in the meeting that we would put it on an agenda for a future meeting. I want to be honest, I equivocated about it being next meeting because seemed like a lot of stuff was coming up for future meetings. So I didn't say, though, that we would put it on. As for circulating the report of the investigation into an out-of-state forensic laboratory to all of the members, all of the accredited laboratories in New York State, I think the easiest way to dispose of this is to just put it up for a vote and let the commission decide what they want to do with it so that we can move on fairly quickly. Marvin, do I have your motion on
You
that?
have my motion.
And is there a second?
Second. Could I speak on it first?
Seconded by District Attorney Fitzpatrick, and he has to speak.
Just a couple of points. At the end of the day, this is clearly a very troubling report about another state regarding a problem that, to my knowledge, and if someone wants to contradict me, feel free to do so, that does not exist in New York State. I think that we are light years ahead of North Carolina and light years ahead of most every other state in terms of the way this commission operates and the way that the labs are regulated. Ultimately, in the Taylor case, what is somewhat glossed over is I cannot, for the life of me, imagine any lawyer that I know of with any reasonable degree of competence allowing that testimony to have gone in, apparently through hearsay methods, unchallenged. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is an adversarial system, and it appears that Mr. Taylor may have had a very, very bad lawyer. I have attempted to research the case. I do not know exactly what it was that led to his exoneration, and I'm not sure how important the role was about whether that was blood on his car or not played in that. As to the other things that Mr. Schechter mentioned was, I have no problem with the report being sent to every lab director. I would suspect, quite frankly, that probably 100% of them are already aware of it. In terms of him sending us copies of the Raleigh News, if we would permit you to do so, hey, what do I have? You send it to me anyway, whether I want it or not. I'd love to see the Raleigh News article, so go ahead. And I really do not agree, though, with the third comment that, and I assume, Marvin, you're referring to Dr. Bino. I do not see that in any way comparable to what happened in North Carolina.
I wasn't referring to Fitzpatrick. I was not referring in any way whatsoever. I apologize if you thought that.
Oh, I thought.
I wasn't referring to Dr. Bino at all.
Well, you said we had an example.
I rather enjoy her intellectual verve and fervor in fighting ABFT. She's my kind of woman.
You said we had an example today of the same problem they had in North Carolina.
Yes, I was talking about Westchester County, where we had the discussion about the latent prints and how the reports are written. There's not enough information in there. That's precisely what the problem was in North Carolina, the blood serology unit, and how you write a report, what you say.
I get it. I do not see that as a valid analogy between what happened in North Carolina. What you had in North Carolina was incompetent lawyering and outright deception by Mr. Deaver, and I don't see that comparable to Westchester at all. As to the last issue in terms of certification, and apparently this is going to be the subject of a discussion at our next meeting, we are not rubber stamps. We do not have to take any accreditation without inquiry. Sometimes it's very vigorous and sometimes it's very revealing. And in terms of better practices, that probably is our ultimate responsibility. And I have seen in the course of my tenure on this commission numerous instances where all commissioners have pointed out things that could improve the way laboratories operate, and I expect that will continue to do that in the future. So getting back to the motion, I would support the motion, which I forgot what the hell it was.
Any further discussion of the motion?
Okay, just support it. Put your hand up. Yes.
Any further discussion of the motion to circulate the lab report from North Carolina?
Yeah, one question for Marvin. Marvin, are you aware that Ralph Keaton, who's synonymous with the Ask Lab, was the assistant director of this lab in North Carolina up until 1995?
100% aware of the fact that Mr. Keaton is the current Ask Lab executive director, and that Mr. Keaton, through 1995, a major period which was covered by the audit for that lab, that he was there. The practices that were discovered in the audit went from 1983 through 2003. He was there through 1995. It has not been raised publicly yet. The issue, because North Carolina is still trying to figure out what to do, whether they've got to review 100 million cases or get a new lab director or vaporize the lab. There has been no discussion yet of prosecutions, criminal prosecution, for those who were derelict in their duty or engaged in subterfuge to hide exculpatory evidence.
Okay, so
one last comment. The co-authors of this North Carolina report are from the FBI lab. One assistant director, the other a staff person. They are big fans of blind testing. In multiple places, you'll find statements like, blind testing is the best practice. Another page, recommend blind testing for all DNA proficiency tests. I think blind testing has been rejected at our meetings in the past. But
it's been rejected where?
By the commission.
At this commission?
Yes. But they're big
we have
fans.
to revisit that after North Carolina.
All right, I have no further discussion. All those in favor of circulating the North Carolina report as moved by Board Member Schechter, please indicate by raising your hands so that I can see folks. Okay, anyone opposed?
Without comment? Without circulating without comment? Without comment?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we know how good you are at commentaries, Judge.
I wasn't going to comment. I was just going to.
I studied them at Syracuse University.
Mr. Chairman, I have another question about this North Carolina SBI matter because of a comment you made, which had to do with whether or not the issue of report writing would come up on the agenda at the next meeting. First of all, Bill, in all deference to your analysis of what happened here in North Carolina, it might be useful to appreciate that the president of the North Carolina District Attorneys Association did not think this was a problem of the adversary system, but rather was a problem of bad science in the sense of bad report writing and bad testimony. The problem was not with the lawyers, the problem was with the employees of the North Carolina SBI. Two, it's not one case, Mr. Taylor's case. They found this kind of inappropriate conduct in 230 cases, several of which involved death penalty. Others involve people who are currently still in prison. Three, it only circles back to what we were talking about before about report writing, which becomes a more acute problem for us to deal with in light of the comments earlier that there is a gap between legacy and international on accreditation of laboratories in our own state system. And given that gap, and given the inability for something else happening right now to correct that gap and to correct those problems, I think time is of the essence and we should begin to address that problem. What I'm going to ask for specifically, though, which would be very helpful to this body in addressing that problem at the next meeting, is that in the interim, I would ask you to have somebody from your legal staff prepare a short memorandum for the members of the commission, simply laying out, because this came up actually at the quality assurance meeting last week as well. When we would say, well, this isn't in the report, they go, it's not in the report, but it's in our case file. If anybody wants to get through discovery, there was some difference of opinion, which probably had to do with, mutual ignorance, okay, as to what actually happens in New York State when somebody requests a case file. And it would be very helpful if we knew, both in terms of the law and in terms of practice, when case files are sought through either the CPL discovery section or through subpoena practice, whether or not defense lawyers are getting the case file. Because if we're going to come out with some kind of policy ultimately on report writing, it would be very helpful if we knew what gets turned over. Because obviously we all agree that people are entitled to get the data. And the one argument that's been put forward by some of the people in the laboratory is, well, it doesn't matter if it's in the report because people can see our case file. So we need to know, as a matter of first principles, whether or not in practice and in theory, these case files are getting disclosed to defendants when they're moved for requested by subpoena. So if your department could at least look at that by reaching out to some of the DAs, by reaching out to some of the defender organizations, and also looking at the applicable case law, then we'd all have a handle of that before it comes up at the next meeting. Is that okay with you, Chairman?
This has been discussed at the Justice Task Force extensively, and
No, Justice Task Force hasn't taken up the Chief Judge's Justice Task Force has not taken up the issue of report writing yet. It's one of the many issues that they intend or hope to cover at some point. So far, they've taken up the issue in a subgroup of eyewitness identification. By the time they get to some of these other issues,
the forensic subcommittee is looking at discovery issues and what's provided to defense attorneys. The DAs are all saying that all of this information, there's a dispute. Yes, everyone's saying, the DAs are saying, yes, we turn all of this over, and some defense attorneys are saying, well, we're not getting it. So we've had this lengthy discussion at a number of meetings. Dr. Corrado has been there and has said, they have everything in the case reports, and that information is turned over.
And I believe that what we decided at the quality management meeting last week was that we would get a report for the Quality Review Committee on the Justice Task Force's analysis of this issue and other issues, frankly, to date, and that we would provide that report at the next Quality Assurance Subcommittee meeting.
one of the things that would be very helpful, though, separate and apart from that update and that report, would be if we had our own understanding of what the law and practice is in New York with respect to disclosure of the underlying data as opposed to the report itself.
This is a judicial question, a question for advocacy between the prosecutors and the defense attorneys in the courtroom. It would probably be a matter that would complicate matters for litigation if the Commission on Forensic Sciences had legal opinions about what is or is not appropriate in individual cases that are judged by individual facts.
I think that the issue, though, is really a scientific one, and that is more of our mandate as forensic scientists and as the institutions that are producing forensic science results. And I'd almost like to put this, if I could risk it, in a positive, aspirational context. Because I can't believe that any of the forensic scientists here, after all that we've been going through, really are going to object. I haven't heard anybody say to another scientist, presumably one that the defense or even the court itself might hire, looking at the data and being able to understand and replicate, if necessary, the results of a particular forensic test. That's science. I'm saying, in some ways, let's forget about what the lawyers may say about this. What about as a matter of science? I haven't heard anybody object to that kind of disclosure. And I think we should be looking at as well ways now in the modern age that we can have electronic data that makes this very, very simple for purposes of disclosure. And
also,
think about that.
Also, just to correct something, it's not purely a matter of the adversarial system. If that was the case, an ASCLD lab would not be including in its international accreditation checklist the contents of written reports. They have decided, their infinite wisdom, that the contents of reports is a matter of science to be dealt with by the forensic laboratories themselves. So if they have made that determination, certainly we should go along with it, at least in terms of process. Moreover, in the conversation we had at the quality assurance meeting last week, there was agreement that the information should be forthcoming. The only disagreement was whether or not it needs to be in the report or whether it's good enough to be in the case file. Everybody agreed that the case file must have sufficient data to support all the conclusions in the report. So if the scientists knew that the data that's in their file, as opposed to what's in the report, is not forthcoming when requested by defense attorneys, I think as a matter of scientific integrity, those scientists would want to include that data in the report, so somebody, like Barry said, could look at it independently and see and vote it yes or vote it down.
Okay.
So clearly it's a matter for this commission to take up, because it's already being taken up by Ashclad Lab.
The matter of report writing will be put down on an agenda of a subsequent meeting for us to cover. We said that earlier in the meeting.
No, but why can't it be the next meeting?
It could be the next meeting. Then other items that may have come up today won't be on next meeting's agenda. There's only so much we can cover in a single meeting agenda, as you might have observed, since we're 15 minutes overdue already and we haven't gone into
I would just ask it to be put on the meeting next time, and why don't you send out the proposed agenda with all these items, and if you suggest that it's too long, then we can get back to you and decide which ones could be postponed. That's all right. Thank you.
The next item on the agenda today is the executive session. We have several people on the phone that we're going to have to cut off, and we have other folks in the rooms, both here and in New York City, that we're going to have to ask to be excused. At this point, I would move to enter into an executive session to discuss information related to the employment history of particular individuals at various labs, as well as to discuss information relating to potential criminal investigations. Is there a second for that?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor of going into executive session, please indicate by raising your hand.
Aye.
We have
Opposed?
Well, just so you...
Thank you.
3.